Mark Twain was born and died during appearances of Halley's Comet. Mark Twain entered the world in 1835 as Halley's Comet burned across the night sky, and he left it in 1910 when that same comet returned. At first glance, this feels like a poetic coincidence, but the deeper you sit with it, the more unsettling it becomes. A human life full of chaos, creativity, regret, and humor, framed perfectly by a cosmic event that operates on its own cold schedule. The comet does not care about genius, fame, or memory. It arrives when it arrives. Yet Twain's existence unfolded exactly between two of its visits, as if time quietly opened a door for him and then closed it with the same key. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is not just the rarity, but the awareness. Twain knew it. He spoke about it openly, almost casually, saying he came in with the comet and expected to go out with it. That statement alone reframes the story from random chance into something that feels eerily intentional. When he actually died within a day of the comet's closest approach, the human mind struggles to dismiss it as meaningless. We are wired to look for patterns, because patterns make life feel less fragile and less absurd. This coincidence hooks us because it forces an uncomfortable thought. Maybe our lives are not as unstructured as we believe. Maybe beginnings and endings are not purely accidental. Even if logic tells us this was chance, emotionally it feels like alignment. It makes us reflect on our own timelines, wondering if invisible markers are already set, quietly orbiting toward us, waiting for the moment they align. Abraham Lincoln dreamed of his assassination days before it happened. Abraham Lincoln reportedly shared a disturbing dream shortly before his death, one in which he walked through the White House and discovered a corpse surrounded by grieving mourners. When he asked who had died, the answer came back: the president, killed by an assassin. What makes this coincidence so unsettling is not just that he dreamed of death, but that he dreamed of the exact role he would soon occupy, his own lifeless body mourned by a nation. Dreams are usually dismissed as mental noise, fragments of fear and imagination stitched together by the subconscious. Yet this one feels different because of its timing and specificity. Lincoln was a man carrying immense psychological weight. He was leading a fractured nation through civil war, absorbing loss on a scale few humans ever experience. His mind was constantly scanning for danger, betrayal, and collapse. In that state, the boundary between intuition and imagination becomes dangerously thin. Emotionally, this coincidence grips us because it raises a question we are never comfortable asking. Can the mind sense what is coming before logic catches up? The brain is a prediction machine, constantly reading subtle cues, threats, tensions, patterns, far faster than conscious thought. Lincoln lived under constant threat, surrounded by hatred, warnings, and unresolved violence. His dream may have been his subconscious connecting dots his waking mind tried to ignore. The reason this story stays with us is because it touches a universal fear. Many people have experienced dreams that felt too real, too precise, too heavy to dismiss. When Lincoln's dream aligned with reality, it blurred the line between foresight and coincidence. It forces us to confront the uneasy idea that sometimes the mind knows something before we are ready to accept it. And once that door opens, it cannot be closed. John F. Kennedy shared uncanny election and death parallels with Lincoln. John F. Kennedy and Abraham Lincoln are separated by a century, yet their lives appear to move in eerie synchrony. Both were elected to Congress in years ending in 46. Both rose to the presidency in years ending in 60. And both were shot on a Friday, in the presence of their wives, by assassins later killed before trial. These are not surface-level similarities. They stack one on top of another until coincidence starts to feel uncomfortably structured. What makes this emotionally gripping is the way it challenges our sense of linear time. We assume history moves forward, learning and correcting as it goes. Yet here are two leaders, 100 years apart, walking almost identical paths toward the same violent end. The repetition feels like an echo, as if history didn't just repeat itself, but remembered itself. Our brains are deeply sensitive to mirrored patterns, and when events align this cleanly across generations, it triggers the same discomfort as déjà vu. It feels familiar, even though it shouldn't be. Psychologically, this coincidence unsettles us because it suggests that roles may matter more than individuals. Lincoln and Kennedy occupied the same symbolic position, a unifying figure during national tension. When people step into powerful roles at volatile moments, the risks, enemies, and outcomes may also repeat. The men change, but the pressures stay the same. This story hooks us because it quietly asks a disturbing question. If two lives can align this precisely across time, how much of history is choice, and how much is a pattern waiting for someone to step into it? The thought lingers because it implies that progress does not erase danger. It only repackages it, waiting patiently for the next familiar shape to appear. Edgar Allan Poe died wearing another man's clothes under mysterious circumstances. Edgar Allan Poe was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore in 1849, wearing clothes that were not his own, ill-fitting, cheap, and completely out of character for a man known to be meticulous about his appearance. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering a name no one could identify, and within days he was dead. No clear cause of death was ever established. What remains is a haunting image, a writer obsessed with madness, identity, and loss, dying as if he had stepped into one of his own stories. This coincidence unsettles us because clothing is deeply tied to identity. To die wearing another man's clothes suggests not just physical displacement, but psychological erasure. It feels symbolic, as if Poe himself had been overwritten. The lack of answers amplifies the unease. Was he robbed, drugged, victim of political voter fraud known as couping? Or did he simply unravel under the weight of his own mind? Every explanation opens more questions than it closes. Emotionally, this story hooks us because it taps into a primal fear, losing control over who we are before we die. Poe's life was already marked by grief, addiction, and instability, and his end feels like the final stripping away of certainty. No witnesses, no closure, just fragments. The mind struggles with unresolved narratives. We want endings to make sense, especially for people who shaped culture and language. Poe's death refuses to cooperate. It mirrors the themes he wrote about relentlessly: confusion, dread, and the thin line between sanity and chaos. That is why this coincidence lingers. It feels less like history and more like a warning that sometimes reality does not explain itself, and identity can dissolve long before the body does. A novel published years before 1912 predicted the Titanic sinking in chilling detail. In 1898, 14 years before the Titanic ever set sail, a little-known novel titled The Wreck of the Titan by Morgan Robertson described the fictional sinking of the largest and most luxurious ship ever built. The ship in the story was called the Titan. It was considered unsinkable. It struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. It lacked enough lifeboats, and it sank in April. The parallels are so precise that reading them side by side feels less like coincidence and more like a glitch in reality. What makes this deeply disturbing is not just the similarity, but the confidence both ships carried. The fictional Titan was marketed as invincible, just as the real Titanic was. That shared arrogance becomes the emotional core of the story. Humans have always trusted technology a little too much, believing scale and engineering could overpower nature. Robertson's novel captures that mindset perfectly, as if he were tapping into a collective blind spot rather than predicting a single event. Psychologically, this coincidence grips us because it challenges our sense of causality. We are taught that fiction imitates life, not the other way around. When reality mirrors a story written years earlier, it destabilizes that comfort. It suggests that human behavior follows patterns so predictable that disasters can be outlined before they happen. Pride, denial, and the dismissal of worst-case scenarios repeat themselves across time. This story lingers because it forces an uncomfortable realization. The warning was already written, not hidden, not symbolic, clear and specific. And still, nothing changed. That makes the tragedy feel heavier, as if fate wasn't silent, but ignored. Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler rose, ruled, and fell following strikingly similar paths. Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler lived more than a century apart, yet their trajectories feel disturbingly synchronized. Both emerged from national humiliation, promising restoration of pride to broken empires. Both were charismatic outsiders who rose rapidly through political chaos, reshaped their nations around personal authority, and convinced millions that destiny was on their side. Their ascent felt unstoppable, fueled by belief, symbolism, and an almost mythic sense of purpose. What makes this coincidence unsettling is how closely their downfalls mirror each other, each pushed too far east, invading Russia with overwhelming confidence and catastrophic miscalculation. Each underestimated winter, distance, and human endurance. As their campaigns collapsed, so did their grip on reality. Allies turned into liabilities, victories into delusions, and the same certainty that built their power became the force that destroyed it. The pattern feels less like coincidence and more like a trap history sets for men who believe they are exceptions to it. Emotionally, this parallel grips us because it exposes a terrifying loop in human behavior. Ambition, once unchecked, follows predictable stages. Confidence becomes arrogance, vision becomes obsession, and control becomes isolation. Different eras, different ideologies, same psychological descent. It suggests that when conditions align, economic pain, wounded identity, collective fear, history does not need new villains. It simply reuses the same blueprint. This story lingers because it forces an uncomfortable realization. Progress does not immunize societies from repetition. Technology changes, uniforms change, speeches change, but the human hunger for power and certainty does not. When leaders start believing they are chosen by fate rather than bound by limits, history has shown exactly how that story ends, and it ends the same way every time. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died on the same historic anniversary. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. What makes this coincidence unsettling is not just the shared date, but the symbolism layered into it. Two men who helped give birth to a nation both left the world on the very day that nation marked its existence. It feels less like timing and more like punctuation, as if history itself decided where the sentence should end. These were not distant acquaintances. Jefferson and Adams were collaborators, rivals, enemies, and eventually close friends. Their relationship mirrored the turbulence of the country they helped create. Intense disagreement followed by hard-earned reconciliation. By the end of their lives, they were writing letters reflecting on liberty, sacrifice, and the fragile experiment they had launched decades earlier. Then, almost impossibly, they exited on the same day, tied forever to the moment they helped set in motion. Emotionally, this coincidence grips us because anniversaries are meant for remembrance, not endings. Death intruding on a celebration creates a strange cognitive dissonance. It forces us to confront how tightly creation and loss are intertwined. Independence Day represents beginnings, hope, and possibility, yet for Jefferson and Adams, it also became a final chapter. The mind struggles to see this as random because it fits too neatly into a narrative we instinctively want to believe. That meaning governs the biggest moments. Even knowing the role of chance, it feels as though their lives were bound to the idea of independence itself, beginning with it and concluding beneath its shadow. The story lingers because it suggests that some lives do not just participate in history, they are inseparable from its calendar, rising and falling with the symbols they helped create. Cleopatra lived closer to the moon landing than to the pyramids. Cleopatra ruled Egypt around 30 BCE, closer in time to the 1969 moon landing than to the construction of the Great Pyramids, which were already over 2,000 years old by the time she was born. This coincidence feels disorienting because it violently reshapes how we picture history. Most people instinctively imagine Cleopatra standing in the shadow of freshly built pyramids, as if ancient Egypt were a single frozen moment in time. In reality, she was already living in what was, to her, a deeply ancient world. What makes this emotionally gripping is how it exposes the illusion of historical distance. Our minds compress the past, blending thousands of years into a single vague image labeled ancient. But this coincidence forces us to confront how layered time really is. Cleopatra was closer to satellites, rockets, and modern science than to the builders who laid the stones we now associate with her civilization. That realization creates a subtle discomfort, because it reminds us that even what we call ancient was once full of people looking back at their own forgotten past. Psychologically, this hooks us because it mirrors how we experience our own lives. We assume we are close to beginnings, closer to origins than endings. Yet most of us are standing far deeper into history than we realize, surrounded by systems, cultures, and structures already ancient in their own right. Cleopatra wasn't at the start of Egypt's story. She was near its end. The coincidence lingers because it reframes progress. It shows that civilizations don't feel old while they are living. They feel current, urgent, and normal, just like now. And that thought quietly unsettles us, because it suggests that one day everything familiar to us will be viewed the same way we now misinterpret Cleopatra's world, flattened, simplified, and misunderstood by those who come long after. Julius Caesar ignored repeated warnings before his betrayal. Julius Caesar was warned again and again that danger was closing in on him. A soothsayer famously told him to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia begged him not to leave their home after dreaming of his murder. Friends urged caution. Signs, omens, and direct advice all pointed in the same direction. Yet Caesar dismissed them, choosing confidence over caution, and walked straight into the Senate, where he was betrayed and stabbed by those closest to him. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is how familiar it feels. Ignoring warnings is deeply human. We tend to trust our status, our intelligence, and our past success to protect us. Caesar had survived countless battles, conspiracies, and political threats. That history bred a sense of invulnerability. When you escape danger enough times, your brain begins to treat warnings as noise rather than signals. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it exposes a dangerous flaw in human thinking: normalcy bias. When nothing bad has happened yet, we assume nothing bad will happen next. Caesar's mind likely reframed each warning as exaggeration or superstition. Power amplifies this effect. The more authority someone has, the less seriously they take the idea that others could harm them. The betrayal itself cuts deeper because it came from trusted allies. It wasn't a sudden ambush by enemies, but a calculated strike by familiar faces. That detail transforms the story from political assassination into something personal and haunting. It lingers because it mirrors modern life. How often do people ignore red flags, dismiss gut feelings, or downplay risks because acknowledging them would force uncomfortable change? Caesar's end reminds us that warnings do not fail. We fail to listen to them, and the cost often arrives quietly, disguised as confidence. Gavrilo Princip assassinated a prince only because he took a wrong turn. Gavrilo Princip became one of the most consequential figures in history, not through careful planning, but through a mistake. The assassination attempt on Archduke Franz Ferdinand had already failed earlier that day. The bomb had missed. The opportunity was gone, or so it seemed. Then the driver of the royal car took a wrong turn, stopped to reverse, and unknowingly placed the Archduke directly in front of Princip, who was standing nearby, stunned by his own failure. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is how small and ordinary the cause was. Not a grand conspiracy, not a flawless plan, but a navigational error, a pause, a moment of confusion. In that brief gap, Princip stepped forward and fired the shots that would ignite World War I and reshape the entire 20th century. Millions of lives, borders, and futures shifted because a car turned onto the wrong street. This story grips us because it attacks our belief that history is driven by intention and control. We like to think world-changing events are the result of deliberate decisions made by powerful people. Instead, this moment reminds us that chaos often sits behind the curtain. The scale of the outcome feels grotesquely mismatched with the simplicity of the cause. Psychologically, this coincidence disturbs us because it mirrors everyday life. We all make small mistakes, wrong turns, delayed choices, moments of hesitation without consequence. But this event suggests that the line between insignificance and catastrophe can be paper thin. It leaves a lingering unease. If history can pivot on something so trivial, then certainty is an illusion, and the future may always be closer to collapse than we're comfortable admitting. Rasputin survived multiple murder attempts before finally dying. Grigory Rasputin became infamous not just for his influence over the Russian royal family, but for how unnaturally difficult he was to kill. According to accounts, he was poisoned with enough cyanide to kill several men, yet showed no reaction. When that failed, he was shot at close range and still attempted to escape. He was beaten, shot again, and only died after being thrown into an icy river. Even then, evidence suggested he was still alive when he hit the water. This story disturbs us because it violates one of our deepest assumptions, that the body has clear limits. Poison, bullets, cold, these are supposed to be final. Rasputin's refusal to die on schedule feels wrong, almost supernatural, and that discomfort is exactly why his legend refuses to fade. When something survives what should be fatal, the mind searches for explanations beyond biology. Faith, fear, myth, or curse rush in to fill the gap. Emotionally, this coincidence hooks us because Rasputin already existed in a space between belief and suspicion. To some, he was a healer. To others, a manipulator. His survival through repeated attempts reinforced both sides. Those who feared him saw proof of something inhuman. Those who believed in him saw confirmation of divine protection. Reality became secondary to perception. What makes this linger is the realization that reputation can become armor. By the time Rasputin finally died, he was no longer just a man, but a symbol people were desperate to erase. His prolonged death feels like a physical manifestation of that resistance. It leaves behind an unsettling thought. Sometimes, power does not come from strength or logic, but from the stories people are too afraid to stop believing. Robert Todd Lincoln was present near 3 presidential assassinations. Robert Todd Lincoln lived a life forever haunted by proximity to death. Not once, but repeatedly, in ways that feel almost scripted. He was the son of Abraham Lincoln and was present at Ford's Theater the night his father was assassinated. That alone would have been enough to mark a lifetime, but history didn't stop there. Years later, Robert was nearby when James A. Garfield was shot, and again when William McKinley was assassinated in 1901. 3 presidents, 3 murders, one man standing uncomfortably close to each moment. This coincidence feels disturbing because it suggests a shadow that follows rather than a single tragic event. Humans are deeply sensitive to patterns involving danger, and when the same person repeatedly appears at the edges of catastrophe, the mind starts asking questions it knows it cannot answer. Robert himself felt this weight. He later refused invitations to presidential events, believing his presence brought misfortune. That belief alone reveals how deeply this pattern affected him. Emotionally, this story hooks us because it touches on survivors' guilt and the fear of being cursed by association. Robert did nothing wrong, yet history kept placing him near irreversible moments. It forces us to confront the idea that tragedy doesn't always strike randomly. Sometimes it clusters, circling the same people, the same families, the same roles. What makes this coincidence linger is its silence. Robert lived on, carried responsibility, held office, and watched history continue to unfold, all while knowing he had witnessed too much. It raises an uncomfortable thought that sometimes survival itself becomes the burden, and being close enough to tragedy repeatedly can feel almost as heavy as being its victim. Nikola Tesla envisioned modern technology but died alone and broke. Nikola Tesla imagined a future that looked uncannily like the world we live in now. He spoke of wireless communication, handheld devices transmitting information instantly, global networks of energy, and machines that could reshape civilization. At a time when most people were still adjusting to electric light, Tesla was already living decades ahead in his mind. And yet, despite shaping the foundation of modern technology, he died in a small hotel room, deeply in debt, largely forgotten, with no family at his side. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is the imbalance between vision and reward. We are taught that brilliance leads to success, that innovation is eventually recognized. Tesla's life quietly contradicts that belief. He gave the world ideas that power cities and connect continents, but he lacked the desire or ability to protect those ideas from people who understood profit better than purpose. His mind was tuned to possibility, not survival. Psychologically, this story hits a deep nerve because it reflects a fear many people carry but rarely say out loud, that your greatest contributions might outlive you, while you don't get to enjoy their impact. Tesla represents the person who sees too far ahead, moves too differently, and pays the price for not fitting the system that benefits from their insight. Isolation often follows people who think beyond their time. The loneliness of his ending sharpens the tragedy. Surrounded by ideas that would later define humanity, he spent his final years feeding pigeons and protecting fragile obsessions. This coincidence lingers because it forces an uncomfortable reflection. Being right is not the same as being rewarded, and sometimes the future takes everything you give it while leaving you behind to fade quietly into history. Leonardo da Vinci designed machines centuries before technology caught up. Leonardo da Vinci filled his notebooks with detailed sketches of flying machines, armored vehicles, mechanical knights, and automated systems at a time when society barely understood basic engineering. These were not vague fantasies. They were precise, functional designs created hundreds of years before the materials, power sources, and scientific knowledge needed to build them actually existed. It feels as if his mind was operating on a different timeline than the rest of humanity. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is the sense of displacement. Da Vinci was born into a world unprepared for him. His ideas arrive too early, like messages sent into the past by mistake. Many of his designs sat untouched for centuries, only to be recognized later as blueprints for helicopters, tanks, and robots. The gap between his imagination and his era creates a quiet tragedy, knowing something that cannot yet be used. Psychologically, this story unsettles us because it challenges how we think about progress. We assume knowledge advances step by step, each generation building neatly on the last. Da Vinci disrupts that comfort. He suggests that breakthroughs don't always come when the world is ready for them. Sometimes they arrive early, misunderstood, ignored, or shelved until time catches up. This coincidence lingers because it forces a personal reflection. How many ideas die simply because they are ahead of their moment? How many people feel out of sync with their time, carrying insights that others cannot yet see? Da Vinci's life reminds us that brilliance does not guarantee impact, and that timing can be as powerful as talent. It leaves us with an uneasy awareness that the future may already exist in fragments, scattered quietly among minds the present isn't ready to listen to. William Shakespeare was born and died on the same date. William Shakespeare is believed to have been born on April 23, 1564, and died on April 23, 1616. While exact birth records from that era are imprecise, the accepted dates create a chilling symmetry, the same calendar day opening and closing the life of the man who shaped language itself. For someone whose work obsessed over fate, time, and mortality, this coincidence feels almost theatrical, as if his life followed the structure of one of his plays. What makes this unsettling is how strongly it satisfies our craving for narrative balance. Humans are uncomfortable with randomness, especially when it involves greatness. A life as influential as Shakespeare's feels like it should have clean edges, a beginning and an ending that align. This coincidence provides that alignment, even if part of it rests on tradition rather than absolute proof. Emotionally, it doesn't matter. The story feels right, and that feeling is powerful. Shakespeare wrote endlessly about cycles, birth and death, rise and fall, love and loss repeating across generations. To imagine his own life completing a perfect loop reinforces the illusion that meaning governs existence. It suggests that time itself may be less chaotic than we fear, capable of symmetry, when a life is important enough. This idea hooks us because it flatters a hidden belief that our lives might also have invisible patterns waiting to reveal themselves. If a man could enter and exit the world on the same date, then perhaps endings are not as abrupt as they seem. The coincidence lingers because it softens the fear of death, reframing it not as an interruption, but as a return to a point already written into the script, waiting quietly for its cue. Amelia Earhart vanished without a trace, leaving no confirmed remains. Amelia Earhart disappeared in 1937 while attempting to fly around the world, and despite one of the largest search efforts of the time, no confirmed remains, wreckage, or final answers were ever found. One moment she was a living symbol of courage and progress, her voice crackling over the radio from the sky, and the next she was simply gone. No body, no certainty, just silence stretching across the Pacific. What makes this coincidence so emotionally gripping is how completely it denies closure. Humans rely on endings to process loss. We need evidence, funerals, graves, something solid to mark the moment when hope officially dies. Earhart's disappearance refuses to provide that. Instead, it traps her in a permanent in-between state, neither alive nor truly gone. Every theory, every possible island, every fragment of radio signal keeps reopening the wound instead of sealing it. Psychologically, this hooks us because it taps into a deep fear of erasure. To vanish without a trace is to be removed not just from life, but from certainty itself. Earhart represented control, skill, and mastery over the sky, yet her end suggests that no amount of expertise can protect us from the unknown. The ocean didn't defeat her loudly. It absorbed her quietly. This story lingers because it mirrors a universal anxiety, the idea that a life can simply dissolve, leaving no explanation behind. Earhart pushed the boundaries of what humans believed possible, and in doing so, she disappeared into the very unknown she sought to conquer. The unanswered questions keep her alive in collective memory, hovering forever between legend and loss, reminding us that sometimes history does not give answers. It only gives echoes. Marie Curie's belongings remain radioactive today. Marie Curie dedicated her life to uncovering the hidden forces inside matter, pushing beyond what science believed was possible. In doing so, she opened the door to radioactivity, a discovery that transformed medicine, warfare, and energy forever. Yet long after her death, the radiation she worked with never truly left her. Her notebooks, clothing, and personal belongings are still so radioactive that they must be stored in lead-lined containers, handled only with protective gear, even more than a century later. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is how literally her work fused with her life. Most people leave behind memories, ideas, or inventions. Curie left behind physical danger. The very materials that made her famous continued to harm long after she was gone, as if her research refused to stay in the past. It feels symbolic of sacrifice taken to an extreme, where curiosity does not just cost comfort or recognition, but the body itself. Psychologically, this story grips us because it blurs the line between achievement and self-destruction. Curie lived in a time when the dangers of radiation were unknown, and she handled glowing substances with bare hands, even carrying them in her pockets. The brain struggles with this because we assume knowledge protects us. Her story reminds us that progress often advances faster than understanding, and pioneers pay the price before anyone else realizes there is one. The emotional weight lingers because her legacy is both miraculous and deadly. The same discovery that saves lives through cancer treatment also took her own. Her belongings remaining radioactive feels like a quiet warning embedded in history that some breakthroughs never fully release their creators, and the cost of changing the world can echo long after the person is gone. Beethoven created masterpieces after losing his hearing. Ludwig van Beethoven began losing his hearing in his late 20s, a slow, terrifying decline for someone whose entire identity was built around sound. By the time he composed some of his greatest works, including his Ninth Symphony, he was almost completely deaf. He could no longer hear orchestras, applause, or even his own music as it was played. Yet what emerged from him during this silence reshaped music forever. This coincidence is emotionally devastating because it inverts everything we expect about talent and limitation. Hearing should have been essential. Sound should have been the foundation. Instead, Beethoven's creativity intensified as the world grew quieter. His music became bolder, more complex, more emotionally expansive, as if the loss of external sound forced him inward into a deeper and more uncompromising connection with his own mind. Psychologically, this grips us because it confronts a fear most people carry, that losing what defines us will destroy us. Beethoven's story suggests the opposite possibility, one that is both inspiring and unsettling. It implies that identity is not always housed where we think it is. When something vital is taken away, the mind may compensate in unexpected, even extraordinary ways. The silence Beethoven lived in was not peaceful. It was isolating, humiliating, and filled with despair. He contemplated ending his life. Yet out of that isolation came music that speaks of struggle, defiance, and triumph with almost painful clarity. This coincidence lingers because it forces a difficult realization. Sometimes creation does not happen in spite of suffering, but through it, and the parts of ourselves we lose may expose depths we never knew were there. Van Gogh achieved fame only after his death. Vincent van Gogh sold almost none of his paintings while he was alive, living in poverty, isolation, and constant self-doubt. Today, his work is worth hundreds of millions and hangs in the world's most guarded museums. This coincidence feels cruel because it reverses the order we expect from life. Recognition comes after suffering, but for Van Gogh it came only after silence. He never knew the impact of what he created, never felt validation, and never saw the world finally understand him. What makes this emotionally gripping is how relatable it feels. Van Gogh's story mirrors a fear many people carry quietly, that effort and passion might go unnoticed, that meaning might arrive too late. He painted obsessively, driven by an internal urgency rather than reward, even as his mental health deteriorated. When he died believing himself a failure, history rewrote him into a genius. That gap between self-perception and legacy is where the discomfort lives. Psychologically, this coincidence unsettles us because it exposes how fragile success really is. Value is not always intrinsic. It is assigned, often by people far removed from the struggle. Van Gogh's work did not change after his death. The world did. Tastes shifted, narratives formed, and suddenly his pain became profound rather than inconvenient. This story lingers because it forces an uncomfortable reflection. How many people are living right now, creating something meaningful while feeling invisible? Van Gogh's posthumous fame suggests that timing, not talent, often determines recognition. It hooks us because it quietly asks whether fulfillment comes from being seen or from creating anyway, even when no one is watching and no applause ever arrives. Houdini died from a blow he didn't expect. Harry Houdini built his entire identity around control. He trained his body to endure pain, escape restraints, and survive situations designed to kill him. Audiences trusted that nothing could touch him without permission. That is what makes his death so unsettling. In 1926, a visitor unexpectedly punched Houdini in the abdomen, testing a claim that he could withstand any blow. Houdini hadn't braced himself. Days later, he was dead from complications related to a ruptured appendix. This coincidence hooks us emotionally because it flips the narrative we rely on for safety. Houdini survived handcuffs, locked boxes, water torture, and staged danger, yet the thing that killed him was ordinary, informal, almost careless. There was no dramatic escape attempt, no grand illusion, just a moment of surprise. It exposes a quiet truth we try to ignore. Mastery does not equal immunity. Control works only when you see the threat coming. Psychologically, this story lingers because it attacks our sense of preparedness. We believe that skill, intelligence, or reputation can protect us. Houdini's death suggests otherwise. The human brain is good at planning for known dangers, but terrible at guarding against the unexpected. That punch mattered not because it was powerful, but because it bypassed awareness. There's also something deeply human about the irony. Houdini dedicated his life to proving death could be delayed, cheated, or escaped. In the end, death didn't challenge him openly. It arrived unannounced, disguised as curiosity and disbelief. That is why this coincidence stays with us. It reminds us that vulnerability often hides in the moments we feel safest, and that sometimes what ends us isn't our greatest fear, but the one thing we never prepared for at all. Isaac Newton secretly practiced alchemy. Isaac Newton is remembered as the embodiment of reason, logic, and scientific clarity, the man who reduced the universe to laws and equations. Yet hidden beneath that public image was a secret obsession that feels almost contradictory. Newton spent years practicing alchemy, obsessively searching for hidden truths, coded messages, and the transformation of matter. He wrote far more about alchemy and mystical texts than he ever did about physics, carefully concealing this work from the world. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is the collision between rational genius and forbidden belief. Alchemy is often dismissed as superstition or pseudoscience, yet Newton treated it with deadly seriousness. He believed the universe contained hidden knowledge, accessible only to those willing to look beyond accepted rules. In private, he wasn't just measuring gravity or motion. He was searching for meaning, power, and transformation at a level science could not yet explain. Psychologically, this grips us because it exposes a truth we rarely admit. Even the most logical minds are drawn to mystery. Newton lived in isolation, intensely private, deeply suspicious of others. Alchemy offered him control in a world he couldn't fully trust, a system where secrets mattered more than approval. It gave structure to uncertainty, turning fear of the unknown into something he could study and manipulate. The emotional pull of this story comes from recognition. Many people present a polished, rational version of themselves while hiding beliefs, curiosities, or doubts that don't fit the image. Newton's secret work reminds us that brilliance does not erase uncertainty. Sometimes, the more someone understands the world, the more they feel compelled to search for what lies beyond it, even if it means walking alone into territory others refuse to acknowledge. Albert Einstein's brain was removed and studied without permission. Albert Einstein died in 1955, believing his body would be cremated and left untouched, wanting no shrine, no spectacle, no mythology built around his remains. Instead, during the autopsy, his brain was removed without consent by the pathologist on duty, photographed, sliced into hundreds of pieces, and preserved for study. Einstein's family was not asked beforehand. The man who unlocked the secrets of the universe lost control over his own body the moment he died. This coincidence is deeply unsettling because it violates a boundary we instinctively believe should be sacred. Death is supposed to be the final moment of autonomy. Yet even in death, Einstein's identity was reduced to an object of curiosity. His mind, which spent a lifetime challenging authority and dogma, was literally claimed by science without permission, as if genius itself forfeited the right to rest. Emotionally, this story hooks us because it exposes an uncomfortable truth about how society treats exceptional people. We celebrate brilliance, but we also feel entitled to it. Einstein's brain became a symbol, not of who he was, but of what others hoped to extract from him. Scientists searched it for physical explanations of genius, as if greatness could be dissected and cataloged. Psychologically, this coincidence lingers because it raises a haunting question. Where does a person end and their legacy begin? Einstein wanted to disappear quietly, yet his body became another experiment. The idea that even the most famous mind in history could be stripped of consent reminds us that recognition does not guarantee respect. Sometimes the very qualities that make someone extraordinary are what prevent them from ever being left alone. Stephen Hawking lived decades beyond doctors' predictions. Stephen Hawking was diagnosed with ALS at 21 and given just a few years to live. Instead, he survived for more than 5 decades, long enough to redefine modern physics, reshape our understanding of the universe, and become one of the most recognizable minds in history. This coincidence feels almost defiant, as if time itself miscalculated when it tried to limit him. What makes this so emotionally gripping is the contrast between expectation and reality. A terminal diagnosis is supposed to narrow life, to shrink possibilities into an ending. For Hawking, it did the opposite. As his body weakened, his intellectual reach expanded. The slower his physical world became, the deeper his mental universe seemed to grow. This inversion unsettles us because it challenges a belief we rarely question, that the body defines the limits of the mind. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it exposes how often predictions shape behavior. Many people collapse inward when told what their future will be. Hawking didn't. He adapted, redirected, and focused obsessively on what still worked. His survival was not just medical, it was psychological. Purpose became fuel. Curiosity became resistance. Meaning stretched time. There is also something uncomfortable about how wrong the experts were. Doctors rely on data, averages, and probability, yet Hawking became an outlier so extreme that it feels personal. It forces us to confront how fragile certainty really is, especially when applied to human potential. His life lingers in the mind because it suggests a dangerous idea, that limits are often statistical, not absolute. When someone refuses to internalize an expiration date, the future can quietly rewrite itself, extending far beyond what anyone thought possible. Charles Darwin delayed publishing his theory out of fear. Charles Darwin developed the theory of evolution years before the world ever heard of it, yet he kept it hidden for nearly 2 decades. This wasn't because he doubted his evidence. It was because he understood the consequences. His ideas challenged religion, identity, and humanity's sense of specialness in the universe. Releasing them meant risking ridicule, rejection, and the collapse of the moral framework most people depended on at the time. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is the tension between truth and survival. Darwin carried knowledge that could change the world, but that same knowledge threatened to destroy his peace, his reputation, and his family's standing. Fear didn't stop him from discovering the truth, it stopped him from sharing it. That delay reveals something deeply human. Sometimes the cost of being right feels heavier than the cost of staying silent. Psychologically, this hooks us because many people recognize the same conflict on a smaller scale. We often hold back honest thoughts, creative work, or uncomfortable truths because we fear social punishment more than inaccuracy. Darwin's hesitation mirrors that instinct perfectly, just on a historic scale. The mind calculates danger not only in physical terms, but in belonging. To be rejected by one's community is to be exposed. This story lingers because it reminds us that progress is not driven by bravery alone. It is slowed, shaped, and sometimes nearly buried by fear. The most transformative ideas often spend years trapped inside the people who discover them, waiting for a moment when the world feels safe enough to hear them, even if it never truly is. Joan of Arc was executed by those she saved. Joan of Arc rose from obscurity as a teenage girl claiming divine visions and went on to change the course of a war. She led armies, inspired a broken nation, and helped secure victories that France desperately needed. Yet once her usefulness faded and political pressure mounted, the same side she fought for abandoned her. Captured by enemies and put on trial, she was condemned and burned alive, while the people she had helped remained silent. What makes this coincidence emotionally devastating is the betrayal wrapped inside gratitude. Joan gave everything, her safety, her reputation, her future, to a cause larger than herself. In return, when she needed protection most, she was treated as disposable. The speed at which admiration turned into denial exposes a brutal pattern in human behavior. People celebrate heroes when they are winning, but distance themselves the moment heroism becomes inconvenient or dangerous. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it mirrors a fear many people carry quietly, that loyalty is conditional. Joan represented hope during chaos, but once stability returned, her presence became uncomfortable. She challenged power structures simply by existing, by being young, female, and unwavering in belief. Rather than defend her, leaders chose safety over integrity. The emotional weight lingers because her death wasn't just an execution, it was abandonment made public. Years later, the same institution that condemned her reversed the verdict and declared her innocent. That delayed recognition cuts deep. It reminds us that history often apologizes too late, and that being right, brave, or selfless does not guarantee protection. Sometimes, those you save survive by letting you fall. Genghis Khan has millions of living descendants. Genghis Khan died more than 800 years ago, yet his genetic signature is still walking the earth. Modern genetic studies suggest that roughly 1 in every 200 men alive today carries a Y chromosome linked back to him. That means millions of people, spread across continents, unknowingly share a direct biological connection to a single man who reshaped history through conquest and fear. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is the scale. Most human lives fade quietly into ancestry, diluted and forgotten. Genghis Khan did the opposite. His power did not end with borders or empires. It continued at the most intimate level possible, reproduction. His status allowed him access to countless women, and his descendants inherited that same advantage across generations, turning violence and dominance into genetic permanence. Psychologically, this grips us because it blurs the line between history and identity. The idea that you could be living an ordinary life, working, loving, struggling, while carrying DNA from one of history's most ruthless conquerors is deeply disorienting. It forces us to confront how little control we have over our origins and how the past lives on inside us in ways we never chose. This coincidence lingers because it reframes legacy. We often think of legacy as ideas, monuments, or names in textbooks. Genghis Khan's most enduring legacy may be invisible, carried silently in bloodlines that span the globe. It leaves an unsettling thought behind. History does not just shape the world we live in. It shapes who we are, cell by cell, whether we want it to or not. Tutankhamun's tomb sparked real deaths and lasting curse legends. Tutankhamun was barely a footnote in history until his tomb was opened in 1922. Almost immediately after, people connected to the excavation began dying under strange circumstances. The most famous case was Lord Carnarvon, who financed the dig and died shortly after from an infected mosquito bite. Newspapers seized on the timing, linking his death to warnings allegedly found in the tomb, and the idea of a curse was born. What made this coincidence terrifying was how quickly coincidence turned into collective fear. Deaths continued, some explainable, others not, but the pattern felt convincing enough to grip the public imagination. Humans are deeply uncomfortable when ancient warnings appear to come true. A sealed tomb surviving untouched for thousands of years feels sacred, and disturbing it feels like crossing an invisible boundary. When people then die, even from ordinary causes, the brain stitches those events together into meaning. The curse became more real than the statistics behind it. Emotionally, this story hooks us because it taps into a primal fear, punishment for trespass. The idea that the past can reach forward and strike the present challenges our sense of safety. It suggests that time does not weaken everything, that some consequences wait patiently. The tomb transformed Tutankhamun from an obscure boy king into a symbol of ancient power, refusing to stay silent. What makes the legend endure is not whether the curse was real, but how perfectly it aligned with human psychology. Once fear takes root, every death becomes confirmation. The story refuses closure because it doesn't need proof, only pattern. It lingers because it whispers a disturbing possibility that some doors are closed for a reason, and once opened, the cost is not always paid immediately, but slowly, one coincidence at a time. George Orwell predicted mass surveillance with unsettling accuracy. George Orwell imagined a world where people were constantly watched, monitored, and corrected by an unseen authority long before such technology realistically existed. When 1984 was published, the idea of omnipresent surveillance felt exaggerated, even paranoid. Cameras were rare, data collection was primitive, and the concept of governments or corporations tracking everyday behavior seemed extreme. Yet decades later, his vision feels less like fiction and more like a description of ordinary life. This coincidence grips us emotionally because it confronts a fear we live inside of, often without noticing. Orwell wasn't just predicting technology, he was predicting behavior. He understood that power doesn't need chains if it can observe. When people believe they are being watched, they begin to regulate themselves. They censor thoughts, alter speech, and suppress curiosity, not because they are forced to, but because they are conditioned. That psychological insight is what makes his predictions so disturbing. What keeps this story hooked in the mind is how subtly it unfolded. There was no single moment where surveillance arrived. It crept in disguised as convenience, safety, and connection. Orwell warned that control would not feel violent. It would feel normal, comforting even. And that is exactly why it works. This coincidence lingers because it forces an uncomfortable reflection. Orwell didn't foresee every device or platform, but he understood the trade humanity would make: privacy in exchange for ease, freedom in exchange for reassurance. His accuracy unsettles us because it suggests that the most dangerous systems are not imposed suddenly. They are accepted gradually until watching and being watched feels like the natural order of things. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein as a teenager during a nightmare. Mary Shelley was only 18 years old when a nightmare burned an image into her mind so vivid that she couldn't escape it. She described seeing a scientist kneeling beside the thing he had assembled, watching it stir to life in a moment of horror and regret. That single disturbing vision became Frankenstein, a story that would outlive her and permanently alter how humanity talks about creation, responsibility, and fear. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is the contrast between age and insight. Teenagers are expected to dream about the future, not grapple with the consequences of playing God. Yet Shelley's nightmare tapped into something timeless, the terror of creating something you cannot control. The fact that this idea came to her not through careful planning, but through sleep, makes it feel less like invention and more like revelation. Psychologically, this grips us because nightmares bypass logic. They are raw, emotional, and unfiltered, pulling fears from deep parts of the mind we don't consciously visit. Shelley had grown up surrounded by death, loss, and radical ideas, and her subconscious stitched those experiences into a story about ambition gone too far. The monster was never just a creature. It was guilt, isolation, and the fear of being abandoned by one's creator. The emotional power lingers because Frankenstein feels prophetic. Long before modern science raised ethical alarms about artificial life and unchecked innovation, a teenager's nightmare captured the cost of creation without responsibility. It reminds us that some stories are not written by choice, but forced into existence by the mind itself, arriving fully formed, demanding to be told. Mozart believed he was being poisoned before dying young. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart fell violently ill in 1791 at just 35 years old, and as his condition worsened, he became convinced that someone was poisoning him. He reportedly believed he had been given aqua tofana, a notorious poison of the era. His body swelled, he was bedridden, and he continued composing while drifting in and out of fever, writing music that would outlive him while believing his death was being deliberately engineered. This coincidence is emotionally haunting because it places paranoia and genius in the same room. Mozart's mind, capable of astonishing clarity and beauty, was trapped inside a failing body filled with fear. Whether the poisoning was real or imagined remains debated, but the belief itself is what lingers. To die young while suspecting betrayal twists the end of his life into something deeply tragic and isolating. Psychologically, this story grips us because it highlights how vulnerability amplifies fear. Mozart was financially strained, overworked, and physically exhausted. In that state, the mind searches for meaning behind suffering, and suspicion becomes a way to make sense of pain. The idea that someone wanted him dead gave his illness a narrative, even if that narrative was false. This coincidence stays with us because it mirrors a universal anxiety, the fear that harm comes not from randomness, but from intent. Mozart died believing his death was not an accident, and that belief shadows his final works with an eerie intensity. It reminds us that brilliance does not protect against fear, and that sometimes the mind, desperate for explanation, turns inward and creates one, leaving history to wonder where illness ends and dread begins. Plato described a lost civilization resembling Atlantis. Plato wrote about Atlantis as a powerful, advanced civilization that vanished beneath the sea in a single catastrophic event. At face value, it reads like a philosophical allegory, a cautionary tale about arrogance and moral decay. Yet what makes this coincidence unsettling is how closely his description resembles real-world ideas of lost civilizations, submerged cities, and geological disasters discovered centuries later. The story refuses to stay safely in the realm of fiction. Emotionally, Atlantis grips us because it plays on a deep human anxiety, that greatness is temporary. Plato described a society at its peak, technologically and culturally superior, undone not by enemies, but by its own excess and a sudden natural collapse. That fear feels timeless. It mirrors modern concerns about progress, outpacing wisdom, about civilizations believing themselves untouchable right before they fall. Psychologically, this coincidence hooks us because it aligns with how memory and myth work together. When we uncover ruins, sunken coastlines, or evidence of ancient disasters, the mind instinctively reaches for narratives that already exist. Plato's account becomes a template, a story waiting to be filled with evidence. Even if Atlantis was meant symbolically, the emotional impact comes from how easily it fits reality. The story lingers because it suggests that history may be far less linear than we assume. Entire cultures can rise, dominate, and disappear, leaving behind only fragments and stories. Atlantis feels haunting, not because it might have existed, but because it could have. It forces the uncomfortable thought that our own civilization may one day be reduced to myth, debated by future minds wondering whether we were real, exaggerated, or a warning passed down through stories that survived when everything else sank. Socrates was executed for questioning authority. Socrates was sentenced to death not for violence, rebellion, or treason, but for asking questions. His crime was encouraging people to think for themselves, to examine beliefs they had inherited without scrutiny, and to challenge those in power through logic rather than obedience. In ancient Athens, this was framed as corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. In reality, it was threatening the comfort of certainty. What makes this coincidence emotionally disturbing is how familiar it feels. Socrates lived in a society that prided itself on democracy and free thought, yet when confronted with ideas that destabilized authority, it chose elimination over reflection. His execution reveals a psychological pattern that repeats across history. Systems tolerate questioning only until those questions expose weakness. At that point, curiosity becomes dangerous. This story hooks us because it highlights a fear most people recognize instinctively. Speaking honestly carries risk. Challenging accepted narratives can isolate you, label you, or erase you. Socrates understood this and still refused to stop questioning. Even when given the chance to escape, he chose to accept his sentence, believing that abandoning his principles would be worse than death. That decision transforms his execution from punishment into a mirror. Psychologically, this lingers because it exposes how authority protects itself. Power rarely silences critics by arguing better. It silences them by controlling consequences. Socrates' death wasn't about law. It was about discouraging others from following his path. The reason this coincidence still resonates is because it hasn't ended. Questioning authority remains one of the fastest ways to attract resistance. Socrates forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Societies often claim to value truth, but only when it doesn't demand change, discomfort, or loss of control. Pythagoras feared beans and believed they contained souls. Pythagoras is remembered as a symbol of logic, numbers, and mathematical order, yet behind that rational legacy was a belief so strange it feels almost surreal. Pythagoras believed that beans were sacred, dangerous, and possibly alive with human souls trapped inside them. He warned his followers never to eat beans, never to touch them, and some accounts even claim he believed beans were connected to the dead. This fear was not a joke or metaphor. It was a rule he lived by. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is the contradiction it exposes. A man who reduced reality to numbers and ratios also believed something as ordinary as a bean could house a soul. It forces an uncomfortable realization. Intelligence does not protect against irrational belief. The human mind is capable of holding extreme logic and extreme superstition at the same time, without seeing a conflict. Psychologically, this grips us because it mirrors how belief systems work even today. Humans often build rigid rules around invisible fears to create a sense of control. For Pythagoras, beans symbolized a boundary between life and death, purity and corruption. Avoiding them wasn't about food, it was about protecting the soul from contamination in a universe he believed was deeply interconnected. The story becomes darker when legends claim that this fear may have led to his death. One account says he refused to cross a field of beans while fleeing enemies, choosing death over violating his belief. Whether literal or symbolic, the idea lingers because it exposes a haunting truth. Sometimes people don't die because of external threats, but because their own beliefs become more powerful than survival itself. Henry VIII changed religion to end a marriage. Henry VIII did not break from the Catholic Church over theology, faith, or spiritual revelation. He did it because he wanted a divorce. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry chose a more radical solution. He severed England from Rome and declared himself the head of a new church. In one decision driven by personal desire, an entire nation's religion was rewritten. This coincidence is emotionally unsettling because of how disproportionate the cause and effect feel. A private marital frustration triggered a public, irreversible transformation that reshaped laws, beliefs, traditions, and power structures for generations. Millions of people were suddenly expected to redefine their faith, not because truth had changed, but because a king's personal life had reached a breaking point. Psychologically, this grips us because it exposes how fragile systems of belief can be when authority is absolute. We often imagine religion as immovable, sacred, and protected from human impulse. Henry's actions tear that illusion apart. They reveal how easily ideology can bend when power feels threatened or denied. The boundary between conviction and convenience collapses. The story lingers because it forces an uncomfortable reflection on leadership and control. When one person holds enough power, personal emotions can masquerade as divine mandate. Henry didn't just change his own fate. He altered marriages, executions, inheritances, and loyalties across an entire kingdom. The coincidence feels haunting because it reminds us that history is not always shaped by grand ideals, but by very human desires, frustration, obsession, and the refusal to be told no. Queen Victoria wore mourning clothes for 4 decades. Queen Victoria lost her husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, and from that moment forward, she never truly rejoined the living world as others knew it. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life, transforming personal grief into a permanent public identity. This coincidence feels heavy because it turns mourning from a phase into a lifetime, as if time itself stopped moving forward for her the day Albert died. What makes this emotionally gripping is how radically it contradicts expectations of power. Victoria ruled the largest empire on earth, yet emotionally, she remained frozen in loss. Grief did not fade, soften, or evolve into memory. It hardened. By refusing to remove mourning clothes, she made sorrow visible every single day, not just to herself, but to an entire nation. Her pain became ritual, routine, and symbol. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it reflects how grief can reshape identity. For many people, loss does not simply hurt, it reorganizes who they are. Victoria did not move on, a phrase society often pressures people toward. Instead, she carried grief forward, weaving it into her sense of self. That choice unsettles us because it challenges the idea that healing must look like recovery. The coincidence lingers because it blurs the line between devotion and self-erasure. Wearing black for decades wasn't just remembrance, it was a declaration that love could permanently alter time. Her mourning became a kind of living tomb, one she willingly inhabited. It forces an uncomfortable reflection. Sometimes the deepest losses don't fade with years. They simply change shape, quietly dictating how long a person remains emotionally present in the world, even while life continues moving around them. Jack the Ripper was never identified. Jack the Ripper murdered at least 5 women in London's Whitechapel district in 1888 and then vanished into history without a name, a face, or a confirmed identity. Despite letters sent to police, endless suspects, and more than a century of investigation, the killer dissolved into the crowd he came from. No arrest, no trial, no certainty. Just a shadow that history never managed to pin down. What makes this coincidence so unsettling is not the violence itself, but the absence of resolution. Humans rely on endings to restore order. We expect evil to be exposed, named, and contained. Jack the Ripper denies that expectation completely. He represents the terrifying idea that someone can break the rules, destroy lives, and still escape not just punishment, but definition. Without an identity, the threat never feels finished. Psychologically, this grips us because anonymity amplifies fear. A known villain has boundaries. An unknown one could be anyone, a neighbor, a stranger, a face you pass every day. The Ripper case unfolded in a densely populated city, which made the uncertainty worse. The killer blended into ordinary life so well that even now, we cannot separate monster from man. That uncertainty lingers in the brain because it mirrors a primal fear, danger hiding in plain sight. This story stays alive because it keeps inviting the mind to participate. Every new theory feels like it might finally close the loop, yet none ever do. The mystery feeds itself. Jack the Ripper isn't remembered because of what he did alone, but because he escaped explanation. He became a symbol of unresolved fear, a reminder that sometimes history does not protect us with answers, and that some horrors survive precisely because they are never fully seen. Sun Tzu's ideas still shape modern warfare. Sun Tzu lived more than 2,000 years ago, yet his words continue to guide decisions that determine who lives and who dies today. The art of war was written for ancient battlefields filled with spears and marching armies, but its core ideas, deception, psychological dominance, timing, and control remain embedded in modern military doctrine, corporate strategy, and even personal power dynamics. What makes this coincidence unsettling is not that his ideas survived, but that human conflict never evolved beyond them. Emotionally, this grips us because it reveals a stagnant side of human nature. Technology changes at a breathtaking pace, but the psychology of conflict stays eerily consistent. Fear, pride, misinformation, and the desire for advantage still drive decisions exactly as they did in Sun Tzu's time. His teachings work because they don't rely on weapons. They rely on understanding the mind. And the human mind has not changed nearly as much as we like to believe. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it blurs the line between wisdom and manipulation. Sun Tzu emphasized winning without fighting, breaking the enemy's will before a battle even begins. That idea feels clever until you realize how often it is used to control perception, justify aggression, and exhaust opponents emotionally rather than physically. Modern warfare doesn't always look like violence. It looks like information, pressure, and silent advantage. The emotional weight lingers because it suggests something deeply uncomfortable. If a text this old still works perfectly, then progress may be an illusion. It means our conflicts are not caused by outdated tools, but by timeless instincts. Sun Tzu's relevance forces us to confront the idea that while civilizations rise and fall, the strategies that exploit human weakness remain permanent, quietly passed down, refined, and reused, waiting for the next battlefield to appear. Confucius still influences billions of lives today. Confucius lived over 2,500 years ago in a world with no modern nations, no technology, and no global communication, yet his ideas still quietly govern how billions of people think about family, respect, authority, education, and morality. Long after his body disappeared, his philosophy embedded itself into cultures, laws, classrooms, and daily behavior, shaping lives of people who may not even know his name. What makes this coincidence emotionally powerful is its invisibility. Confucius does not dominate through monuments or conquest, but through habits. The way children are taught to honor parents, the expectation to respect elders, the belief that personal discipline strengthens society. These ideas feel natural, almost instinctive, yet they trace back to one man reflecting on order during chaos. His influence feels less like history and more like atmosphere, unseen, constant, impossible to escape. Psychologically, this grips us because it challenges how we measure power. We tend to associate influence with force, wealth, or authority. Confucius had none of those. He was often ignored during his lifetime, dismissed as impractical, and died believing he had failed. Yet his thoughts outlived empires, wars, and rulers. That reversal unsettles us. It suggests that ideas, once rooted deeply enough, can become stronger than armies. This coincidence lingers because it reframes legacy in a way that feels both hopeful and unsettling. It implies that what truly endures is not dominance, but repetition. When ideas are passed quietly from parent to child, teacher to student, generation to generation, they stop feeling borrowed and start feeling innate. Confucius did not rule the world, but the world learned to live as if he were still speaking. Sitting Bull predicted his own death. Sitting Bull is said to have spoken openly about his own death before it happened, sensing that the path he was on could only end one way. As a spiritual leader and warrior, he understood the forces closing in around him, political pressure, military threat, and the fear his influence inspired. When he was killed during an attempted arrest in 1890, his earlier words took on a chilling weight, transforming foresight into prophecy. What makes this coincidence emotionally powerful is that it wasn't mystical bravado. It was awareness. Sitting Bull lived in a world where intuition, experience, and survival were tightly linked. He had watched patterns repeat, leaders removed, resistance crushed, warnings ignored. His prediction feels less like supernatural vision and more like clarity born from living inside an unstoppable system. That clarity is terrifying because it suggests that sometimes the future is visible but unavoidable. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it touches a universal fear, knowing what's coming and being unable to change it. Most people avoid imagining their own death, yet Sitting Bull faced it directly. That confrontation strips away comfort and illusion. It reveals the emotional burden of leadership, where responsibility doesn't just risk failure, but guarantees sacrifice. The reason this lingers is because his death wasn't random. It was the consequence of standing firm when compromise meant erasure. His prediction forces us to question how often people sense their end approaching through pressure, isolation, and escalating danger. It suggests that foresight doesn't always offer escape. Sometimes it only grants understanding, leaving a person to walk forward anyway, fully aware of the cost, carrying dignity into an ending they already recognized as inevitable. Ramses II lived unusually long for the ancient world. Ramses II ruled Egypt for more than 6 decades and lived into his 90s, an age that was extraordinarily rare in the ancient world. At a time when most people didn't survive childhood and even royalty often died young from disease or injury, Ramses outlived generations of his own family, wives, children, rivals, and even enemies. He didn't just witness history, he outlasted it. What makes this coincidence emotionally striking is the contrast between human fragility and prolonged dominance. Ramses wasn't simply alive for a long time, he remained powerful, worshipped, and feared for most of his life. Entire generations were born knowing only one ruler. For them, Ramses wasn't a man. He was permanence. That kind of longevity reshapes reality. When authority lasts too long, it begins to feel inevitable, almost divine. Psychologically, this hooks us because the human mind struggles with extremes of time. A long life doesn't just extend experiences, it distorts them. Ramses watched his own children age and die while he remained. He commissioned monuments celebrating victories that slowly faded into legend while he was still breathing. His face was carved into stone again and again, reinforcing the illusion that he would never leave. This story lingers because it blurs the line between human and myth. Longevity in the ancient world felt supernatural, and Ramses leaned into that perception, presenting himself as godlike. Even after death, his presence refused to fade. His mummy was preserved, studied, transported, and honored thousands of years later. The coincidence forces an uncomfortable reflection. When someone lives long enough, power stops feeling earned and starts feeling eternal. And that illusion can be just as dangerous as it is impressive. Christopher Columbus never knew he reached a new continent. Christopher Columbus crossed an unknown ocean believing he would reach Asia, and even after multiple voyages, he died convinced he had done exactly that. He never understood that he had stumbled onto an entirely new continent, one that would later reshape global history, redraw maps, and alter the fate of millions. The name he is remembered by is tied to a discovery he never realized he made. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is the disconnect between impact and awareness. Columbus changed the world in irreversible ways, yet his own understanding of his achievement was incomplete. He searched for something specific, clung to that belief, and filtered reality to fit it. Even as evidence mounted that the land, people, and geography didn't align with Asia, his mind resisted the truth. Letting go of the original goal would have meant admitting that the journey had gone far beyond his control. Psychologically, this story grips us because it reflects a common human tendency. We often don't recognize the magnitude of what we're part of while it's happening. People chase one outcome so intensely that they miss the larger transformation unfolding around them. Columbus measured success by intention, not consequence, and history measured him by the opposite. The emotional tension lingers because it forces a quiet realization. Legacy is often shaped without consent or clarity. Someone can trigger massive change without understanding it, approving it, or even wanting it. Columbus died holding on to a version of reality that no longer existed, unaware that the world had already moved on and redefined his actions. It's a reminder that meaning is not always decided by the one who acts, but by time, distance, and those who come after. Galileo Galilei was punished for telling the truth. Galileo Galilei used observation, mathematics, and evidence to confirm that the Earth was not the center of the universe. What should have been celebrated as progress was instead treated as heresy. He was summoned, threatened, and ultimately forced to publicly deny what he knew to be true. The punishment was not just house arrest. It was the humiliation of being compelled to lie about reality in order to survive. This coincidence is emotionally disturbing because it exposes a deep tension between truth and power. Galileo did not challenge authority with rebellion or violence. He challenged it with facts, and that was enough to make him dangerous. His telescopes showed moons orbiting Jupiter and planets moving in ways doctrine could not explain. In that moment, truth became a threat, not because it was wrong, but because it destabilized belief systems built on certainty and control. Psychologically, this grips us because it mirrors a fear that still exists today. The cost of speaking what others are not ready to hear. Galileo's punishment was a warning, not just to him, but to everyone watching. Knowledge was allowed only if it aligned with authority. Curiosity had limits. Crossing them meant isolation and silence. The story lingers because it feels timeless. Progress often arrives before permission. Those who see clearly are not always rewarded. Sometimes they are restrained. Galileo's forced recantation reminds us that truth does not guarantee safety, and being right does not mean being protected. It leaves behind an uneasy realization that society does not always reject falsehoods. It sometimes rejects reality itself when the truth threatens the structures it depends on. Sigmund Freud feared death while studying it obsessively. Sigmund Freud devoted much of his life to dissecting the human mind, especially its hidden fears, desires, and anxieties. Yet despite building theories around mortality, repression, and the unconscious, Freud himself was deeply afraid of death. This coincidence feels unsettling because it exposes a sharp divide between understanding something intellectually and being able to emotionally accept it. The man who taught the world to analyze fear could not escape his own. What makes this emotionally gripping is how human it feels. Freud didn't just casually study death, he returned to it repeatedly, framing it as a fundamental force shaping behavior. He theorized that much of human action is driven by a tension between the will to live and an unconscious pull toward destruction. And yet, when faced with his own mortality, especially during his long battle with cancer, his writings revealed dread rather than detachment. Knowledge did not grant him peace. Psychologically, this coincidence hooks us because it challenges a comforting illusion that insight leads to control. Freud knew more about fear than almost anyone, but fear remained untouched by that knowledge. It suggests that awareness does not neutralize anxiety. Sometimes it sharpens it. The mind can map terror without ever disarming it. This story lingers because it mirrors a quiet contradiction many people live with. We research, plan, and intellectualize the things that scare us, hoping mastery will follow. Freud's life suggests otherwise. He understood death deeply, yet still recoiled from it. That tension makes his work feel more haunting, not less. It implies that no amount of analysis fully shields us from the most primal fear of all, and that even those who name it, categorize it, and study it relentlessly remain subject to its emotional gravity. H.P. Lovecraft wrote cosmic horror, yet lived in fear. H.P. Lovecraft created stories about vast, indifferent universes where humans are insignificant, powerless, and one revelation away from madness. His fiction suggests a mind comfortable staring into existential darkness. Yet in real life, Lovecraft was deeply anxious, socially withdrawn, and fearful of change, illness, poverty, and the outside world. The man who taught generations to fear the unknown was himself terrified by it. This coincidence grips us because it exposes a strange psychological reversal. Lovecraft didn't write horror from confidence or detachment. He wrote from vulnerability. His stories weren't warnings meant for others. They were expressions of his own dread, externalized into monsters, ancient gods, and uncaring cosmoses. By giving shape to his fears, he gained a sense of control over them, even if only on the page. Emotionally, this hooks us because many people recognize the pattern. Creativity often becomes a shelter for what we cannot confront directly. Lovecraft transformed anxiety into mythology, turning personal terror into something vast enough to share. Yet unlike many celebrated authors, he never lived to see his work appreciated. He died poor, isolated, and convinced he had failed, while the very fears he documented continued to resonate long after him. This story lingers because it challenges the idea that creators stand above their creations. Lovecraft wasn't immune to the horror he imagined. He was immersed in it. His legacy forces an uncomfortable thought. Sometimes art is not a sign of strength, but a coping mechanism. The monsters that haunt fiction are often reflections of the ones already living quietly inside the mind, shaping perception, behavior, and belief long before anyone else sees them. J.R.R. Tolkien turned war trauma into fantasy. J.R.R. Tolkien experienced the brutality of World War I firsthand, watching friends die, enduring constant fear, and surviving conditions that shattered entire generations. Instead of writing directly about trenches and gas attacks, he transformed that trauma into a vast fantasy world filled with dark landscapes, endless marches, corrupted power, and small figures carrying unbearable burdens. Middle-earth may look mythical, but its emotional weight was forged in real suffering. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is how pain was reshaped rather than erased. Tolkien didn't escape his trauma, he translated it. The desolation of Mordor reflects battlefields stripped of life. The quiet endurance of ordinary characters mirrors soldiers forced to keep moving despite exhaustion and terror. Evil in his stories is not glamorous. It is consuming, relentless, and often born from the desire for control, echoing what war does to both victims and aggressors. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it reveals how the mind survives overwhelming experiences. When reality becomes too painful to confront directly, imagination steps in as a protective layer. Fantasy becomes a safe container for emotions that would otherwise destroy the person carrying them. Tolkien's world allowed him to explore loss, fear, loyalty, and hope without reliving the trauma in its rawest form. The emotional pull lingers because it reframes fantasy itself. These stories endure not because they are escapist, but because they are honest in disguise. Tolkien proved that imagination can carry truth more gently than memory. His work reminds us that some of the most beloved worlds are not born from comfort or leisure, but from people trying to make sense of devastation without letting it consume them. C.S. Lewis died the same day as Kennedy. C.S. Lewis died on November 22, 1963, the exact same day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. One death shook the world in real time, broadcast live through radios and televisions, freezing history in a single violent moment. The other passed almost unnoticed, quietly slipping into the background of global shock. Two lives ended on the same day, yet only one was truly seen. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is the imbalance of attention. Kennedy's death was loud, public, and traumatic. Lewis's death was silent, private, and nearly invisible by comparison. A man who shaped the inner lives of millions through words, imagination, and faith was overshadowed by a single catastrophic event. It forces us to confront how collective focus works and how easily significance can be drowned out by spectacle. Psychologically, this grips us because it mirrors a fear many people carry. That meaning does not guarantee recognition. Lewis spent his life exploring morality, belief, doubt, and the unseen struggles of the human soul. Yet when he died, the world was too distracted to mourn him. History chose which death mattered more, not based on depth of impact, but on immediacy and shock. This coincidence lingers because it quietly questions how legacy is measured. Kennedy changed politics. Lewis changed minds and inner worlds. One death became a global wound. The other became a footnote discovered later. It reminds us that influence does not always announce itself, and that some of the most powerful lives end not with noise, but with silence, felt deeply by individuals, even when the world is looking elsewhere. Benjamin Franklin nearly died experimenting with lightning. Benjamin Franklin is remembered as a symbol of reason, curiosity, and scientific progress, yet one of his most famous experiments came dangerously close to killing him. While studying electricity, Franklin conducted experiments involving lightning at a time when almost nothing was understood about its behavior. A single miscalculation could have ended his life instantly. The irony is unsettling. A man trying to illuminate nature nearly erased himself in the process. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is how thin the line is between discovery and destruction. Lightning is raw, uncontrollable power, and Franklin approached it with little more than curiosity and courage. There were no safety protocols, no precedent, only a willingness to risk everything for understanding. That willingness feels admirable and terrifying at the same time. Progress, in this moment, demanded vulnerability. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it challenges the idea that intelligence guarantees safety. Franklin was brilliant, methodical, and forward-thinking, yet brilliance did not make him immune to danger. Knowledge often grows fastest at the edge of risk, where mistakes carry irreversible consequences. His survival feels less like certainty and more like luck. The story lingers because it reframes how we view innovation. We tend to celebrate breakthroughs without confronting the personal cost behind them. Franklin's near-death experience reminds us that advancement is built on people who willingly stepped into the unknown, accepting that understanding the world might require sacrificing themselves to it. It leaves an unsettling thought behind. Many of the comforts we enjoy today exist only because someone once stood close enough to danger that survival was never guaranteed, and discovery was inseparable from mortality. Hernán Cortés toppled an empire with a tiny force. Hernán Cortés arrived in the Americas in 1519 with only a few hundred soldiers and somehow dismantled the vast Aztec Empire, a civilization of millions with advanced cities, armies, and political systems. On paper, this should have been impossible. Numbers alone say he should have been erased instantly. Yet within a few years, an empire that had dominated the region for centuries collapsed under the pressure of a force that barely registered as an invasion. What makes this coincidence emotionally disturbing is how little raw strength actually mattered. Cortés didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he understood fractures. He exploited internal resentment, manipulated belief systems, and weaponized fear and disease. The Aztecs were not defeated in a single moment of violence. They were slowly destabilized from within. This taps into a deep psychological discomfort. The realization that massive systems can fall not from overwhelming force, but from targeted disruption. This story hooks us because it mirrors how power collapses in human life. Relationships, institutions, and identities rarely fall apart all at once. They erode. Cortés understood perception better than numbers. To some, he appeared godlike. To others, he appeared as a means of revenge. That ambiguity allowed him to move through the empire like a crack spreading through glass. The coincidence lingers because it challenges a comforting belief that size and strength guarantee survival. The Aztec Empire was vast, confident, and deeply rooted, yet it underestimated how fragile complexity can be. Cortés' victory wasn't just military, it was psychological. It reminds us that systems often fall not when they are weakest, but when they believe they are untouchable, and fail to recognize how small forces, applied precisely, can undo everything they thought was permanent. Nostradamus left predictions still argued over centuries later. Nostradamus wrote his predictions in the 16th century using cryptic language, symbolism, and fragmented verses that were deliberately difficult to interpret. Centuries later, people still argue over whether he predicted wars, assassinations, pandemics, and global disasters. What makes this coincidence unsettling is not just that his writings survived, but that every generation seems able to find itself reflected in them. Emotionally, this grips us because his prophecies feel unfinished, as if they are waiting for events to give them meaning. Nostradamus rarely named names or dates. Instead, he described chaos, fire, suffering, and power shifts in vague but evocative terms. That ambiguity is exactly what gives his work its power. The human mind is wired to complete patterns, especially when fear is involved. When something terrible happens, people instinctively search backward for signs that it was foretold, and Nostradamus provides a ready-made mirror. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it exposes how deeply humans want reassurance that events are not random. If disasters were predicted, then maybe they were inevitable, and inevitability feels less frightening than meaninglessness. His verses offer a strange comfort, the idea that someone, somewhere, saw it coming. Even skepticism doesn't fully dissolve the unease, because doubt still keeps the conversation alive. The emotional tension lingers because Nostradamus never clarifies anything. His predictions don't expire, don't resolve, and don't close. They remain open-ended, reshaped by whoever reads them next. That makes them feel alive, constantly reborn through interpretation. The unsettling truth is that his work may say less about the future and more about us, our fears, our need for narrative, and our habit of finding destiny in hindsight when uncertainty becomes too heavy to bear. History keeps repeating itself because human nature doesn't change. History often feels like a long chain of unique events, each shaped by its own era, technology, and culture. Yet when you step back, the patterns become impossible to ignore. Power rises and corrupts. Fear fuels division. Pride blinds judgment. Ambition overreaches. Again and again, different faces step into the same roles and make eerily similar choices. The circumstances change, but the instincts underneath remain untouched. What makes this idea emotionally unsettling is how personal it feels. We like to believe humanity is progressing morally as fast as it is technologically, but history suggests otherwise. The same impulses that drove ancient wars, betrayals, and collapses still operate today, just dressed in modern language and tools. Greed still disguises itself as necessity. Control still calls itself security. Violence still justifies itself as protection. Psychologically, this grips us because it attacks the comforting illusion that we know better now. Human beings are driven by emotion long before logic: fear of loss, hunger for status, need for belonging, desire for certainty. These traits once helped us survive. Now, on a global scale, they repeat disasters. When pressure rises, people revert to instinct, not enlightenment. This coincidence keeps listeners hooked because it shifts responsibility inward. History is no longer something that happened to other people in the past. It becomes a mirror. If human nature stays the same, then repetition is not a mystery, it's a warning. Every generation believes it will be the exception, the one that finally breaks the cycle. Yet the cycle persists, quietly suggesting that unless self-awareness evolves faster than power, the future will continue to resemble the past, no matter how advanced it looks on the surface. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world before dying at 32. Alexander the Great reshaped the ancient world at an age when most people are still defining who they are. By his early 30s, he had conquered territories stretching from Greece to India, toppling empires and spreading culture, language, and power at a scale never seen before. Then, abruptly, he was gone. No gradual decline, no final chapter of reflection, just a sudden death that froze his legend in youth. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is the contrast between speed and finality. Alexander lived faster than history itself, compressing what could have been multiple lifetimes into barely a decade of conquest. His death at 32 feels wrong because it collides with our expectations of legacy. We associate greatness with longevity, yet Alexander achieved immortality through intensity rather than time. That imbalance leaves the mind unsettled. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it triggers a deep anxiety about unfinished potential. Alexander left no clear successor, no completed vision, only fragments of an empire that immediately began to fracture. His death exposes how fragile even the most overwhelming success can be. Power evaporates quickly when the person holding it disappears. The reason this lingers is because it challenges how we measure a life. Length suddenly feels irrelevant. Impact becomes the only metric that matters. Alexander's story forces an uncomfortable reflection. If everything could end abruptly, what truly defines a meaningful life? Years lived or force of action? His early death turns ambition into both inspiration and warning, suggesting that burning intensely can reshape the world, but it may also leave no time to understand what that reshaping ultimately cost. Alexander's burial site vanished and was never found. Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world, reshaped history before the age of 33, and ensured his name would never be forgotten. Yet his final resting place, the one thing meant to preserve his body and legacy, disappeared. Ancient sources describe grand tombs, public viewings, and even visits by later rulers, but somewhere across centuries of wars, shifting cities, and collapsing empires, Alexander's burial site simply vanished. This coincidence feels deeply unsettling because it inverts the promise of legacy. Alexander achieved what few humans ever have: lasting fame. His name survived intact, repeated in classrooms, books, and myths. But his physical presence did not. The body that conquered continents was lost to time, unmarked, unclaimed, and unreachable. It forces a disturbing contrast between memory and matter. History remembered the idea of Alexander, but forgot the man himself. Psychologically, this hooks us because humans crave permanence through symbols. Tombs exist to anchor legacy, to say, "This mattered." Losing Alexander's burial site strips away that anchor. It suggests that even the most powerful figures cannot fully control how they are remembered. Time doesn't erase greatness loudly. It erodes it quietly, one detail at a time. The story lingers because it mirrors a fear many people carry silently, that achievement does not guarantee preservation. Alexander wanted immortality through conquest, and in one sense, he got it. But the disappearance of his tomb reveals the uncomfortable truth beneath that dream. Reputation may endure, but the physical self dissolves. What remains is a story retold by others, shaped by their needs, long after the original presence has been completely absorbed by the past. Percy Shelley drowned, and his heart refused to burn during cremation. Percy Shelley died young, violently, and almost symbolically. In 1822, he drowned at sea when his boat was caught in a sudden storm. Because of health laws at the time, his body was cremated on the beach in full view of friends. As the flames consumed his remains, something impossible seemed to happen. His heart did not burn. While the rest of his body turned to ash, the heart remained intact, pulled from the fire and preserved. What makes this coincidence emotionally disturbing is how perfectly it aligns with Shelley's identity. He was a poet of overwhelming emotion, obsession, longing, and idealism. His writing fixated on passion, rebellion, and the endurance of feeling beyond physical limits. To imagine the literal heart refusing to be destroyed feels less like biology and more like metaphor made real, as if his defining trait could not be erased even by death. Psychologically, this grips us because the heart is more than an organ in human symbolism. It represents love, belief, and emotional truth. A heart surviving fire challenges our expectation that death is total and final. It creates the unsettling sense that something essential can outlast the body, that identity may cling on even when everything else is stripped away. The story becomes even heavier, knowing the heart was kept by those who loved him, passed between hands like a relic. It transforms grief into something tangible. Shelley's death did not just end a life. It left behind an object charged with meaning and unresolved emotion. This coincidence lingers because it collapses the distance between poetry and reality, reminding us that sometimes symbolism doesn't stay on the page. Sometimes it burns, resists, and refuses to disappear. Lord Byron kept Shelley's heart for years. Lord Byron kept the heart of his close friend Percy Bysshe Shelley after Shelley drowned in 1822. When Shelley's body was cremated on the beach, his heart did not burn. Whether due to a medical condition or sheer chance, it survived the flames intact. What followed feels less like history and more like obsession. Byron took possession of the heart, treating it not as a relic to be buried, but as something too emotionally charged to let go. This coincidence is emotionally disturbing because it collapses the boundary between grief and fixation. Keeping a friend's heart is not an act of reason. It is an act of refusal. Refusal to accept death as final. Refusal to let memory settle into the past. Byron was known for intensity in both love and loss, and the heart became a physical anchor for emotions that had nowhere else to go. It turned mourning into possession. Psychologically, this grips us because it reveals how attachment can override social and moral norms. When loss is sudden and overwhelming, the mind looks for something tangible to hold on to. A body part becomes a symbol of connection, identity, and permanence. The heart, long associated with emotion and essence, made the loss feel contained, almost manageable. The story lingers because it forces an uncomfortable question about how far grief can go before it becomes something darker. Byron wasn't preserving a scientific specimen. He was preserving meaning. Shelley's heart later passed through other hands, wrapped in poems, hidden in drawers, becoming a secret artifact of unresolved love and sorrow. This coincidence unsettles us because it shows that even brilliant minds are not immune to irrational attachment, and that sometimes the dead continue to live, not in memory, but in objects we are not ready to release. Edwin Booth saved Lincoln's son months before his brother killed Lincoln. Edwin Booth once pulled a young man back from the edge of a moving train platform, saving him from certain death. The man he saved was Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of Abraham Lincoln. Months later, Edwin's brother, John Wilkes Booth, would assassinate that same president. The symmetry of this coincidence is almost unbearable, one brother preserving a Lincoln life while the other destroyed one. What makes this emotionally gripping is how it exposes the randomness of moral alignment. Edwin Booth was one of the most respected actors of his time, known for discipline and restraint. His brother followed a radically different path, driven by ideology and resentment. The idea that these two men came from the same family unsettles us because it challenges our belief that character is predictable. Good and evil do not always separate cleanly. Sometimes they grow side by side. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it collapses cause and effect into a single frame. If Edwin hadn't acted that day, Lincoln's son would have died. If John Wilkes hadn't acted later, the president would have lived. One moment of instinctive compassion, one moment of deliberate violence, bound together by blood and timing. The mind struggles to process that balance. The coincidence lingers because it suggests that history is shaped not only by grand decisions, but by fleeting encounters that never make sense until afterward. Edwin Booth spent the rest of his life haunted by his brother's actions, knowing that his own act of saving was forever entangled with an act of killing. It leaves a disturbing thought behind. Sometimes the universe doesn't choose sides. It allows opposites to coexist, letting one hand give life while the other takes it away, all within the same name. Vladimir Lenin's preserved body is still displayed a century later. Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, yet his body never truly left public life. Instead of being buried, it was chemically preserved and placed on permanent display, turning a dead man into a political symbol frozen in time. Generations who never lived under his rule have stood in silence, staring at his face, unchanged, as if history itself refused to let him decay. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is how it blurs the boundary between death and authority. Death is supposed to be final, a moment where power dissolves and memory takes over. Lenin's preserved body interrupts that process. By keeping him physically present, the state transformed a human being into an idea that could not age, weaken, or be questioned. The body became propaganda, silently reinforcing permanence and control. Psychologically, this hooks us because humans instinctively associate decay with honesty. Bodies decomposing remind us that everyone is equal in the end. Lenin's preservation denies that truth. It creates the illusion that ideology can outlast biology, that belief systems can be embalmed and kept intact if handled carefully enough. That illusion is powerful and dangerous. The story lingers because it forces an uncomfortable reflection on how far societies will go to preserve meaning. Lenin did not choose this fate, yet his body became a tool visited by millions long after his voice fell silent. The coincidence isn't just that he's still there, but that people keep coming to see him. It suggests that humans are not only afraid of death, but of letting go, so afraid that sometimes we choose to preserve the dead rather than confront the fact that even revolutions, like bodies, are meant to end. George Washington never lived in the White House. George Washington is inseparable from the image of the American presidency, yet he never once lived in the building that would come to symbolize it. The White House was still under construction when his presidency ended, meaning the man who defined the role never stepped inside the home designed to represent it. He led a revolution, shaped a government from nothing, and set the standard every future president would be judged against, without ever inhabiting the seat of power most people associate with him. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is the disconnect between foundation and reward. Washington carried the burden of uncertainty, rebellion, and fragile nation building at a time when failure meant collapse. He governed without precedent, without guarantees, and without the security future leaders would inherit. Yet the symbols of stability, comfort, and authority came only after he was gone. It feels like the classic human pattern of pioneers bearing the cost while successors inherit the structure. Psychologically, this story grips us because it mirrors how contribution often works in real life. The people who build systems rarely get to enjoy them. They operate in chaos, improvisation, and risk, while later generations experience the polished result and assume it was always inevitable. Washington's absence from the White House exposes how history compresses struggle into symbols, erasing the discomfort that came first. The emotional weight lingers because it reframes legacy. Washington is remembered everywhere in stone, statues, and names, yet he never lived in the house most closely tied to his title. It quietly reminds us that impact and comfort do not arrive together, and that the most influential roles are often played before the stage is finished being built. Benjamin Franklin wrote his own epitaph as a joke. Benjamin Franklin wrote his own epitaph decades before his death, and instead of treating it with reverence or fear, he turned it into a joke. He compared his body to the worn cover of an old book, content to be discarded, while expressing confidence that the work inside would be revised and improved in a new edition. Death, for him, was not an ending, but an edit. This coincidence is emotionally striking because it flips our usual relationship with mortality. Most people avoid thinking about their death, and those who do often approach it with dread or solemnity. Franklin approached it with wit. By joking about his own burial, he stripped death of its power to intimidate. Humor became a form of control, a way to stare at the inevitable without flinching. Psychologically, this grips us because it reveals how intelligence can reframe fear. Franklin didn't deny death. He acknowledged decay, impermanence, and the fragility of the body, but by casting it as a temporary binding for ideas, he shifted value away from flesh and toward contribution. The joke wasn't shallow. It was a quiet philosophy. That meaning outlives matter. This coincidence lingers because it feels both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it suggests death doesn't erase impact. Unsettling because it challenges us to ask what, if anything, we leave behind worth reprinting. Franklin's epitaph endures not because it is funny, but because it models a rare psychological freedom. When someone can joke about their own end, it reveals a mind that has already made peace with impermanence, and in doing so, robbed death of its final word. Hernán Cortés destroyed ships to stop his men from retreating. Hernán Cortés made a decision so extreme it still unsettles people centuries later. After landing in Mexico, vastly outnumbered and deep in hostile territory, he ordered his own ships destroyed. There would be no retreat, no escape, no return home. By removing every possible way back, he forced his men to confront a single reality. Survival now depended entirely on moving forward. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is how brutally it mirrors moments people face in their own lives, stripped of options. Cortés understood something unsettling about human psychology. As long as escape exists, commitment is fragile. Fear looks for exits. By destroying the ships, he didn't just eliminate retreat, he rewired motivation. The men were no longer choosing to advance. They had to. Courage became mandatory, not optional. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it reveals how often hesitation is fueled by safety nets. When alternatives disappear, the mind shifts. Panic turns into focus. Doubt turns into action. Cortés engineered a situation where fear could no longer paralyze because there was nowhere for it to run. That realization is uncomfortable because it suggests that clarity often comes only after choice is removed. The reason this lingers is because it reframes control. Cortés didn't dominate his men through strength alone, but through inevitability. He understood that humans perform differently when consequences are absolute. The story forces an unsettling reflection. How many times do people stall, not because they lack ability, but because they've left themselves an escape? Cortez burned ships symbolize a terrifying truth, that sometimes progress only begins when turning back is no longer possible, and commitment is enforced by the absence of mercy, not the presence of hope. Genghis Khan's burial was hidden by killing witnesses. Genghis Khan conquered more land than any individual in history, reshaping continents through sheer force of will. Yet, when he died, his empire ensured that no one would ever know where he was buried. According to historical accounts, those who carried his body to its resting place were killed to protect the secret, and the soldiers who carried out the killings were themselves executed. The goal was absolute erasure of the location, leaving no marker, no tomb, no place for enemies or followers to gather. What makes this coincidence so disturbing is the extreme commitment to disappearance. Burial is usually about remembrance, honor, and closure. In this case, it was about silence. Genghis Khan ruled through fear, and even in death, fear remained part of his legacy. The act of killing witnesses wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. His power did not end with his life, it extended beyond it, enforcing obedience even after his body was gone. Psychologically, this hooks us because it reverses our expectations of legacy. Most leaders want monuments. Khan wanted absence. By hiding his burial completely, he denied history a physical anchor, forcing memory to exist without a place. That absence magnifies his presence. The mystery keeps him alive in imagination far longer than a grave ever could. This story lingers because it touches a primal tension between control and surrender. Death strips away authority, yet Khan's followers attempted to control even that. The secrecy suggests an understanding that bodies can become symbols, and symbols can weaken or distort power. By erasing the body's location, they preserved the myth. It leaves us with an unsettling realization. Sometimes the most powerful legacy is not what is shown, but what is deliberately hidden forever. King Umberto I met his exact double days before being assassinated. Umberto I of Italy once sat down to dinner with a man who appeared to be his mirror in every disturbing sense. The two men looked identical, shared the same name, were born in the same town on the same day, and had wives with the same name. Even their professions oddly overlapped in symbolism. The meeting unsettled everyone present, but it ended as a strange anecdote, until days later, when the king was assassinated, and news arrived that his double had also died that same day. What makes this coincidence emotionally chilling is how completely it erases the comfort of uniqueness. Identity is something we cling to for stability. The idea that another person could exist with the same face, name, origin, and life details feels like reality malfunctioning. It introduces the unsettling thought that individuality may be thinner than we believe, that lives can overlap in ways that feel scripted rather than lived. Psychologically, this grips us because doubles tap into a primal fear: replacement. Seeing yourself reflected outside your body destabilizes the sense of control and continuity. For a king whose power depends on singularity and authority, encountering a living replica is especially disturbing. It quietly suggests that even the most powerful roles are interchangeable. The emotional tension deepens when both lives end almost simultaneously. It feels less like coincidence and more like symmetry taken too far, as if the universe corrected something it had duplicated. The story lingers because it resists explanation. There is no lesson wrapped neatly inside it, no logic to lean on. It leaves behind a haunting impression that sometimes reality mirrors itself not to teach, but to unsettle. and that even fate may have reflections we never see coming. Napoleon Bonaparte survived dozens of assassination attempts. Napoleon Bonaparte lived under constant threat, yet death seemed to miss him again and again. Throughout his rise and reign, there were plots involving bombs, poison, gunmen, and conspiracies from both enemies and former allies. Some attempts failed by seconds. Others collapsed due to mistakes, bad timing, or sheer chance. One explosion meant to kill him instead killed bystanders while Napoleon walked away untouched. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is the repeated sense of inevitability being denied. When danger surrounds someone so consistently, survival starts to feel unnatural. Each failed attempt reinforced the belief, both in Napoleon and in those around him, that he was protected by fate. This perception fed his confidence, his risk-taking, and eventually his recklessness. Surviving so many brushes with death didn't humble him. It convinced him he was untouchable. Psychologically, this grips us because it exposes a dangerous feedback loop. When someone escapes consequences repeatedly, the brain begins to rewrite reality. Luck transforms into destiny. Survival becomes proof of superiority. Napoleon's repeated escapes likely strengthened his belief that normal limits did not apply to him, making later catastrophic decisions feel justified, even ordained. The story lingers because it highlights how survival itself can be misleading. Escaping death is not the same as mastering it, yet the mind often interprets it that way. Napoleon's life shows how narrowly avoided endings can inflate ego instead of caution. The unsettling implication is that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to a powerful person is not dying early, but surviving long enough to believe they never will. Abraham Lincoln's body train was sabotaged after his death. Abraham Lincoln did not escape violence even after he was assassinated. As his body was transported by train across the country for public mourning, credible threats and sabotage attempts emerged along the route. Rails were tampered with, plots were uncovered, and security had to be secretly altered to prevent the train carrying his corpse from being derailed. Even in death, Lincoln remained a target. What makes this coincidence emotionally disturbing is the idea that hatred can outlive its object. Death is supposed to be a full stop, a moment where conflict ends and reverence begins. Instead, Lincoln's body became a moving symbol of unresolved rage. The war was over, the president was dead, yet the hostility surrounding him refused to settle. It suggests that violence is not always about the person, but about what they represent. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it exposes how symbols carry more weight than flesh. Lincoln's body was no longer capable of action, yet it still inspired fear and fury. That reaction reveals something uncomfortable about collective psychology. When people attach their anger to an idea, eliminating the individual doesn't dissolve the threat. The symbol must be attacked too. The coincidence lingers because it reframes safety itself. If a man cannot be left in peace even after death, then resolution feels fragile. Lincoln's final journey became another battlefield, quiet and unseen, where the past refused to let go. It leaves behind a haunting thought. Some conflicts don't end with a heartbeat. They continue moving forward, carried by memory, resentment, and meaning, long after the body they once focused on is already gone. Queen Elizabeth I never married but ruled for 44 years. Elizabeth I spent her entire reign refusing marriage in a world where a woman's power was expected to flow through a husband. For 44 years, she ruled alone, navigating war, religion, betrayal, and constant pressure to secure a male heir. Every proposal she rejected was seen not just as a personal choice, but as a political risk. Yet her refusal became the very foundation of her authority. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is how it defied the logic of her time. Marriage was supposed to stabilize rule, protect the throne, and legitimize power, Elizabeth understood something deeper. Sharing power meant losing control. By remaining unmarried, she prevented foreign kings from claiming England, avoided internal factions forming around a royal husband, and kept the nation's loyalty focused solely on her. Her personal sacrifice became a political weapon. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it exposes the cost of autonomy. Elizabeth gave up intimacy, companionship, and a conventional life in exchange for stability and control. That trade-off feels uncomfortably familiar. Many people recognize the tension between personal fulfillment and ambition, between connection and self-preservation. Elizabeth lived that conflict in full view of an entire nation. The story lingers because it reframes power as restraint rather than dominance. Elizabeth ruled not by expanding herself through marriage, but by narrowing her identity into a symbol. She became the Virgin Queen, an idea larger than any relationship could contain. Her longevity on the throne suggests that sometimes strength comes not from adding more to your life, but from refusing what the world insists you must have in order to be complete. Henry Ford kept a vial of Edison's last breath. Henry Ford kept a small glass vial sealed and labeled as containing the final breath of Thomas Edison, taken at the moment of Edison's death. The object still exists today, preserved not as a scientific artifact, but as something far more intimate and unsettling. Breath is the most fragile sign of life, invisible and fleeting, yet Ford wanted it captured, contained, and kept close, as if refusing to let the moment fully pass. What makes this coincidence emotionally disturbing is how it collapses the boundary between innovation and obsession. Edison was a symbol of progress, electricity, and invention, while Ford represented mass production and modern industry. Their friendship fused ambition with reverence, but this act reveals something deeper than admiration. Preserving a last breath suggests a desire to hold on to presence itself, to trap the instant when life becomes absence. It turns death into an object. Psychologically, this story grips us because breath carries profound symbolic weight. It represents spirit, consciousness, and continuity. To believe it could be bottled hints at a quiet denial of finality. Humans struggle deeply with endings, especially when tied to people who shaped our sense of possibility. Ford did not just lose a friend, he lost a source of inspiration that helped define his worldview. The emotional tension lingers because the vial serves no practical purpose. It doesn't heal, power, or invent anything. It simply exists as proof that someone could not let go. In a world obsessed with progress, this small glass container reveals something timeless and vulnerable. Even the architects of the modern age were haunted by mortality, and sometimes the desire to preserve life outweighs the logic that built everything else. Thomas Edison believed he could talk to the dead using machines. Thomas Edison, a man synonymous with logic, electricity, and modern invention, openly suggested near the end of his life that it might be possible to communicate with the dead using technology. He theorized that human consciousness could be made up of tiny, indestructible units, and that if these units survived death, a sufficiently sensitive machine might detect or communicate with them. Coming from one of history's greatest rational minds, the idea feels deeply unsettling. This coincidence grips us because it collapses the boundary between science and the supernatural. We expect spiritual curiosity from mystics, not from the architect of the modern age. Edison spent his life proving that unseen forces could be harnessed, electricity, sound waves, light, and that history makes his belief feel less absurd than it initially sounds. If invisible forces could be turned into voices and light, why not consciousness itself? Psychologically, this story hooks us because it reveals a universal human tension. Even the most analytical minds are not immune to the fear of disappearance. Edison was not chasing ghosts for entertainment. He was confronting mortality using the only language he trusted: machines. Technology became a coping mechanism, a way to negotiate with death without surrendering to faith. The coincidence lingers because it reframes invention as something more intimate than progress. Edison wasn't just trying to build the future. He was trying to reach beyond the end. The idea that one of the fathers of modern science still hoped for proof of continuation reminds us that no amount of knowledge fully silences the fear of extinction. At some point, even the most brilliant minds look at death and ask the same question everyone does: is this really the end? Nikola Tesla claimed to receive signals from outer space. Nikola Tesla believed that during his experiments with radio waves and electromagnetic signals, he intercepted transmissions that did not originate from Earth. He openly suggested that these signals might be coming from intelligent life beyond our planet. At the time, this claim pushed him from the edge of genius into the territory many dismissed as delusion. What makes this coincidence unsettling is how closely his ideas brush against questions science still hasn't answered. Emotionally, this grips us because Tesla occupied a space where imagination and innovation overlapped. He was often decades ahead of his era, envisioning technologies the world would only understand long after his death. When someone like that claims to hear something no one else can, it creates discomfort. We're forced to ask whether the boundary between insight and instability is thinner than we like to believe. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it mirrors a common fear surrounding brilliance, that seeing too far ahead isolates you. Tesla worked alone, thought alone, and eventually lived alone. In that isolation, his mind became both a laboratory and an echo chamber. The idea that he might have detected something real, but lacked the tools or language to prove it, is deeply unsettling. History is full of discoveries initially labeled impossible. The coincidence lingers because modern science has since confirmed that the universe is filled with signals, radiation, and frequencies once unimaginable. While there is no proof Tesla heard extraterrestrial communication, the fact that his claim is no longer absurd keeps the story alive. It suggests a haunting possibility that sometimes people don't hear voices because they're losing touch with reality, but because they're listening to something the rest of the world hasn't learned how to detect yet. Hedy Lamarr helped invent technology used in Wi-Fi. Hedy Lamarr was celebrated as one of Hollywood's most glamorous actresses, admired for her beauty and screen presence, while quietly working on ideas that would shape the technological future. During World War II, she co-invented a frequency-hopping communication system designed to prevent enemy forces from jamming radio-controlled torpedoes. At the time, the invention was largely ignored. Decades later, that same principle became foundational to Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and modern wireless communication. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is the contrast between how she was seen and who she actually was. Lamarr was reduced to an image, praised for appearance while her intelligence was dismissed as a novelty. Her invention wasn't rejected because it lacked value, but because it came from someone the world refused to take seriously. The idea that technology shaping billions of lives came from a woman no one thought to listen to creates a quiet sense of injustice. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it exposes a bias many people recognize. Talent that doesn't fit expectations is often ignored. Lamarr worked at night, inventing between film shoots, driven not by recognition, but by a need to contribute. When the military shelved her idea, she received no credit, no reward, and no encouragement to continue. The world wasn't ready to accept brilliance from someone it had already categorized. This coincidence lingers because it reframes innovation as something fragile. Progress doesn't always come from institutions or laboratories. Sometimes it comes from overlooked minds working in silence. Lamar's legacy reminds us that history often credits ideas long after it has failed the people who created them, and that brilliance can exist unnoticed, waiting for a future that finally knows how to see it. Alan Turing died after biting a poisoned apple. Alan Turing helped lay the foundations of modern computing and played a decisive role in breaking Nazi encryption during World War II, saving millions of lives in the process. Yet after the war, he was prosecuted by the same country he helped protect for being gay. Stripped of dignity, chemically punished, and isolated, Turing was later found dead beside an apple laced with cyanide, a quiet and disturbing end to one of the most important minds in human history. What makes this coincidence emotionally devastating is how symbolically loaded it feels. An apple, something ordinary and almost innocent, became the final object in the life of a man whose work unlocked extraordinary power. The image is simple, almost childlike, yet it carries unbearable weight. It feels cruelly poetic, as if something pure was turned lethal, mirroring how Turing himself was treated, celebrated in secret, condemned in public. Psychologically, this story grips us because it exposes the violence of rejection. Turing was not destroyed by failure or ignorance, but by humiliation and exclusion. The mind that could see patterns no one else could was crushed by a society unwilling to accept difference. When someone is forced to deny their identity, the damage does not stay external. It turns inward, slowly, quietly. The emotional tension lingers because recognition came too late. Apologies, pardons, and honors arrived after his death, unable to reach the person who needed them most. Turing's end forces an uncomfortable reflection. Intelligence and contribution do not guarantee protection, and progress does not always mean compassion. Sometimes the future is built on the backs of people it refuses to save, leaving behind a story that feels less like history and more like a wound that never fully closes. Turing's work secretly saved millions during World War II. Alan Turing fought World War II without a uniform, without a battlefield, and without public recognition. While bombs fell and soldiers died, Turing worked in silence, breaking Nazi encryption codes that were believed to be uncrackable. His work at Bletchley Park allowed the Allies to intercept enemy plans, reroute ships away from ambushes, and shorten the war by years. Millions of lives were spared, yet the world was never told. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is the invisibility of the impact. History tends to glorify visible sacrifice, soldiers, generals, victories you can photograph. Turing's contribution left no monuments at the time, no applause, no acknowledgement. The people whose lives were saved never knew they were in danger, and never knew who protected them. Survival happened quietly, anonymously, while credit went elsewhere. Psychologically, this grips us because it challenges how we define heroism. Turing endured isolation, secrecy, and immense pressure, knowing that failure meant catastrophe, yet success meant silence. His victories were measured not in celebrations, but in disasters that never happened. That kind of burden is uniquely heavy, carrying responsibility without recognition, knowing your work matters precisely because no one will notice it. The story lingers because of what followed. After the war, the same government that owed him everything prosecuted him, humiliated him, and erased him from public honor. The man who helped end the war was treated as disposable once peace returned. This coincidence leaves a haunting realization behind. Sometimes the people who save the most lives are not protected by the world they protect. Their legacy survives not through praise, but through absence. The absence of deaths, tragedies, and timelines that never came to be because one mind, working in silence, changed everything. Julius Caesar was stabbed 23 times, yet died from one wound. Julius Caesar was attacked by a group of conspirators who stabbed him 23 times in a coordinated act of betrayal. Yet according to historical accounts, only one of those wounds was actually fatal. The rest, while violent and deliberate, were not enough to kill him on their own. This coincidence feels deeply unsettling because it exposes how overwhelming force does not always equate to decisive impact. Emotionally, this grips us because it reframes betrayal. Caesar wasn't killed by a single enemy, but by many people he trusted, each delivering a blow that symbolized rejection rather than necessity. The fact that only one wound truly ended his life makes the others feel almost symbolic. Acts of fear, conformity, or desperation layered on top of a fate already sealed. It suggests that once momentum begins, people continue striking even after the outcome is inevitable. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it mirrors how group behavior overrides individual responsibility. In moments of collective action, especially violent ones, people often participate not because their action is needed, but because not acting feels more dangerous. Caesar's death shows how crowds can amplify cruelty without increasing effectiveness. One wound ended him, but 22 others were delivered anyway. The reason this lingers is because it challenges how we understand power and downfall. Caesar survived wars, rebellions, and enemies across continents, only to fall in a confined space surrounded by familiar faces. His death wasn't efficient. It was chaotic and excessive. That excess leaves behind an unsettling truth. History is often shaped not by precision, but by human fear, multiplying itself. Sometimes one decision seals a fate, and everything that follows is noise driven by panic, loyalty, and the instinct to follow what everyone else has already started. Pliny the Elder died trying to study a volcanic eruption. Pliny the Elder spent his life obsessively documenting the natural world, driven by a belief that knowledge was worth any personal cost. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, he didn't flee. Instead, he moved closer. As commander of the Roman fleet and a relentless scholar, Pliny sailed toward the eruption to observe it firsthand and to help evacuate others. He never returned. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is the alignment between his curiosity and his death. Pliny didn't die because he was careless or unaware. He died because he stayed true to who he was. His need to understand the world overpowered his instinct for self-preservation. The very trait that made him one of history's great naturalists also placed him directly in harm's way. That symmetry feels both noble and unsettling. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it highlights the danger of devotion. Curiosity is often celebrated as a virtue, but Pliny's death exposes its darker edge. There is a point where the desire to know more overrides the instinct to survive. Many people recognize this pull in smaller ways, the urge to keep pushing, to keep observing, even when the cost becomes clear. This story lingers because it turns death into a final act of identity. Pliny's last moments were not defined by panic, but by purpose. He died trying to understand something larger than himself, facing the raw force of nature without flinching. The coincidence forces an uncomfortable reflection. Sometimes the pursuit of truth does not end in discovery, but in sacrifice. And sometimes the line between passion and self-destruction is thinner than we want to admit. Galileo Galilei went blind studying the sun. Galileo Galilei spent his life turning his eyes toward the sky, determined to understand truths no one else was willing to accept. Through relentless observation of the sun, planets, and stars, he gathered evidence that challenged the worldview enforced by powerful institutions. Over time, the very act of staring into the sun damaged his vision, and in his final years, the man who expanded humanity's view of the universe lived in complete darkness. What makes this coincidence emotionally haunting is the sacrifice embedded within it. Sight is the gateway through which Galileo accessed the cosmos, yet his pursuit of knowledge slowly took it away. There is something deeply unsettling about a truth seeker losing the very sense that allowed him to see that truth. It feels like knowledge demanding a physical price, as if understanding the universe required giving up a part of oneself in return. Psychologically, this story grips us because it reflects a common human pattern: obsession fueled by purpose. When someone believes deeply in a mission, limits fade. Galileo continued his work despite warnings, persecution, and physical strain. His mind was fixed on what mattered more than comfort or safety. The brain can override self-preservation when meaning is at stake, pushing the body beyond what it can endure. The emotional weight lingers because his blindness coincided with his silencing. Condemned by the church and placed under house arrest, Galileo was cut off from both the sky and the world that refused to listen. The irony is brutal. He helped humanity see its place in the universe more clearly than ever before, yet he died unable to see anything at all. It leaves behind a quiet, unsettling reminder that sometimes enlightenment comes at the cost of darkness. Isaac Newton lived in isolation after a nervous breakdown. Isaac Newton, the man who defined the laws governing motion, gravity, and the structure of the universe, suffered a severe psychological collapse in his early 50s. He became paranoid, withdrawn, and deeply distrustful of those around him. Friends were cut off. Letters went unanswered. For years, one of the greatest minds in human history retreated into isolation, unraveling quietly behind closed doors. This coincidence is emotionally unsettling because it contradicts how we imagine genius. We tend to associate intellectual brilliance with stability and control, yet Newton's mind, capable of extraordinary clarity, fractured under pressure. He had spent decades in relentless focus, sleeping little, obsessing over work, and pushing his thoughts beyond normal limits. Eventually, the same intensity that produced insight turned inward and consumed him. Psychologically, this grips us because it exposes the cost of extreme cognition. Newton was not just thinking differently from others. He was thinking constantly, relentlessly, without rest. When the mind never disengages, it can lose its ability to regulate reality. Suspicion replaces trust. Isolation feels safer than connection. His withdrawal was not arrogance, but self-preservation. The story lingers because it forces us to confront a difficult truth. Brilliance does not protect against breakdown. In some cases, it increases the risk. Newton's isolation reminds us that the human brain, no matter how powerful, has limits. When those limits are crossed, the fallout is not always dramatic or visible. Sometimes it looks like silence, distance, and a slow retreat from the world. The coincidence feels haunting because it suggests that behind monumental discoveries may lie unseen personal costs, paid quietly by minds pushed further than they were ever meant to go. Charles Dickens survived a train crash and later wrote about it. Charles Dickens was traveling by train in 1865 when it derailed and plunged off a bridge, killing and injuring many passengers. Dickens survived, but the experience marked him deeply. He helped the wounded, moved through wreckage surrounded by death, and narrowly escaped himself. What makes this coincidence unsettling is that years later, echoes of that crash began appearing in his writing, as if the event had quietly embedded itself into his imagination. Emotionally, this grips us because trauma doesn't end when the body survives. Dickens never fully recovered psychologically. He suffered anxiety, nightmares, and an intense fear of travel afterward, yet he rarely spoke publicly about the incident. Instead, the experience resurfaced indirectly, transformed into scenes of chaos, dread, and sudden catastrophe in his fiction. The crash didn't just threaten his life, it rewired how he perceived danger and control. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it reveals how the mind processes survival. When something nearly kills us, it doesn't always announce itself as trauma. It hides, waiting for expression. For Dickens, writing became that outlet. His imagination turned lived horror into narrative, allowing him to revisit the moment safely, repeatedly, reshaping it into something he could manage. The coincidence lingers because it highlights how close experience and creation really are. Art often feels imaginative and detached, but here it was forged directly from fear. Dickens didn't invent catastrophe, he remembered it in disguise. The story unsettles us because it suggests that survival doesn't mean escape. Sometimes it means carrying the moment forward, allowing it to bleed quietly into the stories we tell, shaping them long after the danger itself has passed, lingering in the background like a train that never fully stopped. Dickens kept souvenirs from the dead. Charles Dickens was celebrated for his empathy, moral insight, and deep concern for human suffering, yet he carried a habit that feels quietly unsettling. After witnessing tragic events, including violent deaths and public executions, Dickens often kept physical mementos connected to them. He held on to objects tied to the deceased, treating them not as morbid trophies, but as anchors to memory, emotion, and truth. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is the tension between compassion and obsession. Dickens was intensely sensitive to suffering. He felt other people's pain deeply, sometimes too deeply. Keeping souvenirs from the dead allowed him to preserve emotional proximity to events that shook him. These objects became proof that the suffering was real, that it mattered, and that it should not be forgotten. In a world that moved on quickly, Dickens refused to let loss dissolve into abstraction. Psychologically, this hooks us because it reflects how humans process trauma. When an experience is overwhelming, the mind clings to tangible reminders as a way to retain control. Objects become containers for memory, grief, and meaning. Dickens wasn't fascinated by death itself, he was haunted by it. Holding on to these items may have been his way of preventing emotional numbness, a defense against forgetting too easily. The story lingers because it exposes the cost of awareness. Dickens saw too much, felt too much, and remembered too well. His writing gave voice to society's forgotten people, but that empathy didn't switch off when the page ended. The souvenirs reveal a man unwilling to separate himself from the suffering he witnessed. They suggest that bearing witness leaves marks, and sometimes those marks take physical form, quietly carried forward by those who refuse to look away. H.P. Lovecraft never saw success during his lifetime. H.P. Lovecraft created entire cosmic mythologies that would later influence literature, film, games, and pop culture on a massive scale, yet he died believing he had failed. During his lifetime, his stories were largely ignored, underpaid, or dismissed as strange and unmarketable. He lived in poverty, constantly doubting his talent, surviving on small magazine checks while pouring his imagination into worlds that felt too vast for his era to understand. What makes this coincidence emotionally unsettling is the gap between influence and awareness. Lovecraft wrote about insignificance, about humans being tiny and powerless in an uncaring universe, and his own life reflected that belief with cruel precision. He never experienced validation, stability, or the sense that his work mattered. The horror he described wasn't just fictional monsters, but the fear of being unseen and irrelevant, a fear that followed him to his grave. Psychologically, this story grips us because it exposes a painful truth about recognition. Talent does not guarantee acceptance, especially when it challenges comfort or convention. Lovecraft's ideas were too bleak, too strange, too ahead of their time. The mind struggles with delayed reward, and when effort brings no reinforcement, it can hollow a person out from the inside. His anxiety, isolation, and declining health fed into one another, reinforcing the belief that obscurity was his destiny. The emotional weight lingers because success arrived only after he was gone. The world embraced his visions once he could no longer feel relief, pride, or security. His story forces a quiet, uncomfortable reflection. Some people give everything to the future and receive nothing in return while they are alive, leaving behind work that proves their worth only after it no longer matters to them. Lovecraft feared madness and died in poverty. H.P. Lovecraft spent his life writing about cosmic horror, fragile sanity, and minds collapsing under truths they were never meant to understand. Yet behind the fiction was a man deeply afraid that madness was not just a theme, but a personal destiny. He believed insanity ran in his family, watched loved ones deteriorate mentally, and lived with the constant anxiety that his own mind might eventually betray him. What makes this coincidence emotionally disturbing is how closely his fears aligned with his reality. Lovecraft lived in near constant isolation, struggled with illness, poverty, and depression, and never experienced real success during his lifetime. His stories were largely ignored or dismissed while he was alive. He died young, malnourished, in pain, and nearly forgotten, convinced he had failed both financially and creatively. The recognition came only after he was gone. Psychologically, this grips us because it blurs the line between imagination and self-awareness. Lovecraft didn't just invent horror, he articulated a worldview shaped by dread, insignificance, and the fear of losing control of one's mind. His cosmic monsters were not just creatures, but metaphors for internal collapse. Writing became both an outlet and a mirror, reflecting anxieties he could never fully escape. The story lingers because it exposes a cruel asymmetry in legacy. Lovecraft shaped an entire genre, influencing generations of writers, filmmakers, and artists, yet he never knew it. His fear was not that the universe was meaningless, but that he would disappear unnoticed within it. That fear came true in life, and was undone only by history. The coincidence is haunting because it suggests that sometimes the people most afraid of being forgotten are the ones whose voices echo the longest, long after they are no longer here to hear it. Salvador Dali believed he was his dead brother reincarnated. Salvador Dali grew up knowing he was not the first child named Salvador in his family. His older brother, also named Salvador, died before he was born, and his parents told him from a young age that he was the reincarnation of that lost child. This belief didn't fade with age. Dali carried it into adulthood, shaping how he understood himself, his identity, and his art. The coincidence feels unsettling because it blurs the line between inheritance and replacement. Emotionally, this grips us because identity is supposed to be singular. To grow up believing you exist as a continuation of someone else creates a fracture at the core of selfhood. Dali wasn't just expected to live his own life, but to unconsciously redeem a death that came before him. That psychological weight lingers beneath his surreal imagery, where distorted faces, doubles, and fragmented bodies appear again and again. Psychologically, this story hooks us because it highlights how early narratives become internal truths. When a child is told who they are before they can decide for themselves, that story doesn't disappear. It embeds itself into perception. Dali's obsession with duplication, mirrors, and dream logic can be seen as attempts to reconcile that split, being both himself and someone he never met. The coincidence lingers because it forces an uncomfortable reflection on how much of identity is chosen and how much is imposed. Dali didn't just paint the subconscious. He lived inside a paradox where his existence was defined by absence. The belief that he was a reincarnation may not have been literal truth, but emotionally it was real enough to shape a mind that would go on to redefine reality itself, forever questioning what it means to be original. Dalí designed his own coffin. Salvador Dalí spent his life blurring the line between reality and performance, and he refused to let that boundary return even in death. He personally designed his own coffin and chose to be buried beneath the floor of his museum, ensuring that visitors would literally walk over his body. For Dalí, death was not an ending to be handled by others. It was one final act of authorship. What makes this coincidence emotionally gripping is the absolute control it represents. Most people avoid thinking about their death, treating it as something distant, abstract, or frightening. Dalí confronted it directly and turned it into art. Designing his coffin wasn't morbid curiosity, it was a statement. He refused to become passive, even in death. The idea of surrendering his final image to chance was unacceptable to him. Psychologically, this hooks us because it exposes a tension we all feel but rarely admit. Death represents the ultimate loss of control. Dalí's response was to reclaim that control symbolically, shaping how he would be remembered and physically positioned in the world. By placing himself beneath his own work, he fused identity, legacy, and mortality into a single experience. His body became part of the exhibition. This story lingers because it challenges how we think about endings. Dalí understood that memory outlives flesh, and he wanted to choreograph that memory carefully. Visitors may come for the art, but they unknowingly participate in his final performance with every step. The coincidence feels unsettling because it suggests that for some people, existence doesn't stop at death. It simply changes form. Dalí ensured that even in silence, he would remain present, watching, provoking, and quietly reminding the world that creation and control were inseparable parts of who he was. J. Edgar Hoover kept secret files on nearly everyone powerful. J. Edgar Hoover built his power not just through authority, but through knowledge people never consented to give him. As the longtime head of the FBI, Hoover secretly collected files on presidents, politicians, celebrities, civil rights leaders, and anyone who posed a threat to his influence. These files contained rumors, private behavior, surveillance details, and personal weaknesses, information meant not for justice, but for leverage. For decades, the most powerful people in America feared him not because of the law, but because he knew too much. What makes this coincidence emotionally disturbing is how quietly power shifted hands. Hoover was never elected, yet presidents hesitated to challenge him. His control didn't come from visibility, but from secrecy. He understood something deeply human. People fear exposure more than punishment. By holding private truths in the dark, he positioned himself above accountability, turning information into a weapon sharper than authority. Psychologically, this story grips us because it reveals how surveillance changes behavior. When people believe they are being watched, they self-censor, comply, and surrender agency without being forced. Hoover created an atmosphere where obedience was psychological, not physical. The threat was never spoken aloud, but it didn't need to be. Silence did the work. The unease lingers because many of those files vanished after his death, leaving unanswered questions about how much power he truly wielded and how much history he quietly shaped. Hoover's legacy forces an uncomfortable realization. Control does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like knowledge kept hidden, waiting to be used. And once fear becomes internalized, power no longer needs to announce itself. It simply exists, unquestioned, in the shadows. Hoover's secrets disappeared after his death. J. Edgar Hoover ruled the FBI for nearly half a century, amassing immense power not just through law enforcement, but through information. He kept detailed secret files on politicians, celebrities, activists, and even presidents, documents rumored to contain personal scandals, private weaknesses, and damaging truths. These files were his real weapon. They ensured loyalty, silence, and fear. People obeyed, not because Hoover was right, but because he knew too much. What makes this coincidence deeply unsettling is what happened next. When Hoover died in 1972, the infamous secret files vanished. No public archive, no verified inventory, no clear explanation. Decades of collected leverage simply dissolved. The man who built his power on knowing everything left behind nothing anyone could find. It was as if the evidence of his control chose to die with him. Psychologically, this grips us because it taps into a primal anxiety about hidden power. Information feels permanent in the modern world, yet Hoover's secrets evaporated at the moment they were most vulnerable. The disappearance suggests deliberate erasure, quiet hands moving quickly before accountability could arrive. It leaves us wondering how much history was edited before anyone noticed. The story lingers because it exposes how control operates in the shadows. Hoover understood that fear doesn't require action, only the possibility of exposure. Once he was gone, the threat collapsed and the secrets lost their purpose. This coincidence feels haunting because it reminds us that some of the most influential forces in history leave no physical trace. Power doesn't always end in scandal or revelation. Sometimes it simply disappears, taking the truth with it, leaving only suspicion behind and a silence that feels far too intentional to be accidental.